The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of energy that flows through stars, planets, and the void between them. For thousands of years, the Jedi have studied this mystical field, believing it to be the singular source of all supernatural power in existence. But what happens when something from beyond the stars arrives, a power that operates on entirely different laws, drawn from dimensions the Force cannot touch? The sky above Coruscant's Industrial District 7-7-3-9 tore open without warning. No hyperspace signature. No ship registration. No gravitational distortion that would indicate an approaching vessel. One moment, the smog-choked air hung thick with the usual haze of speeder exhaust and factory emissions. The next, reality itself split apart like fabric under a blade, and a figure in a tattered blue robe fell through the rift screaming a word in a language no protocol droid could translate. Dr. Stephen Strange hit the Durasteel platform 40 stories above the underworld traffic lanes, his cloak of levitation billowing frantically to arrest his momentum. The ancient relic managed to slow his descent enough that the impact only knocked the wind from his lungs rather than shattering every bone in his body. He rolled across the grimy metal surface, coming to rest against a cluster of industrial waste containers that reeked of chemicals he didn't recognize. The portal above him. A swirling mandala of golden energy that had carried him from the Sanctum Sanctorum through the space between dimensions, collapsed inward with a sound like thunder played backwards. Strange reached up instinctively, his trembling hands tracing symbols in the air, attempting to reopen the gateway. Orange sparks flickered around his fingers, but the portal refused to form. The familiar tug of the dark dimension's energy, the cosmic forces he'd learned to channel through years of training under the Ancient One, felt distant. Muted. Like trying to hear a whisper through soundproof glass. No, 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 Strange muttered, pushing himself to his feet. His body ached from the fall, but years of magical study had taught him to compartmentalize pain. He needed to assess the situation, understand where, or perhaps when, he'd landed. The spell he'd been casting should have sealed the breach in the multiverse that Baron Mordo had torn open. Instead, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The Darkhold's interference. An Infinity Stone reaction. He'd felt the fabric of reality buckle, watched the boundaries between dimensions dissolve, and then. A speeder roared past overhead, its repulsor engines leaving a trail of disturbed air that smelled of ozone and burning fuel. Strange looked up, and his analytical mind, still a surgeon's mind despite everything, began cataloging impossibilities. The building stretched upward for kilometers, layered architecture that seemed to have been built and rebuilt countless times, each era stacking upon the last. Flying vehicles moved in organized lanes through the air, some sleek and elegant, others battered and utilitarian. In the distance, a massive pyramidal structure dominated the skyline, its design speaking of governmental authority. And above it all, the sky held not one sun but a sprawl of stars visible even through the atmospheric haze. Stars in configurations Strange didn't recognize despite having studied astronomical charts during his research into cosmic entities. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't even Earth's dimension. A group of humanoids, some recognizably human, others decidedly not, emerged from a nearby doorway. They wore mismatched armor and carried weapons that looked like sophisticated energy rifles. One of them, Irradian with multifaceted eyes and green skin, pointed at Strange and shouted something in a language composed of clicks and whistles. "I don't suppose any of you speak English?" Strange called out, his hands already moving into. Painted in red and white with unfamiliar markings, descended rapidly. Its side doors were already open, and figures in white armor dropped down on cables with military precision. Their armor was unlike anything Strange had seen, pristine white plates with black bodysuit visible at the joints, helmets with distinctive T-shaped visors that gave them an insectoid appearance. "Drop your weapons." One of the armored figures commanded, his voice filtered through a helmet speaker but speaking in perfectly understandable English, or whatever translation effect was occurring in this dimension. The attackers who'd been shooting at Strange hesitated for only a moment before opening fire on the new arrivals. The white-armored soldiers moved with practiced coordination, their own weapons, similar energy rifles but more standardized and military-grade, returning fire with controlled bursts. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. The attackers fell one by one, stunned or incapacitated by the soldiers' superior training and equipment. The leader of the armored squad approached Strange, his rifle lowered but ready. Through the helmet's visor, Strange could see nothing but darkness and his own reflection. "You're under Republic protection now, civilian. Are you injured?" "Republic?" Strange kept his hands visible but ready to cast if needed. "What Republic?" The soldier's helmet tilted slightly, a gesture that might have indicated confusion. "The Galactic Republic. You're on Coruscant, the capital world. Those were Black Sun enforcers, you're lucky we were patrolling this sector." He paused, studying Strange more carefully. "You're not from the core worlds, are you?" "That outfit. I've never seen anything like it." "You could say I'm from out of town," Strange replied carefully. His mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. A galactic republic implied a civilization spanning multiple worlds. The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of energy that flows through stars, planets, and the void between them. For thousands of years, the Jedi have studied this mystical field, believing it to be the singular source of all supernatural power in existence. But what happens when something from beyond the stars arrives, a power that operates on entirely different laws, drawn from dimensions the Force cannot touch? The sky above Coruscant's Industrial District 7-7-3-9 tore open without warning. No hyperspace signature. No ship registration. No gravitational distortion that would indicate an approaching vessel. One moment, the smog-choked air hung thick with the usual haze of speeder exhaust and factory emissions. The next, reality itself split apart like fabric under a blade, and a figure in a tattered blue robe fell through the rift screaming a word in a language no protocol droid could translate. Dr. Stephen Strange hit the Durasteel platform 40 stories above the underworld traffic lanes, his cloak of levitation billowing frantically to arrest his momentum. The ancient relic managed to slow his descent enough that the impact only knocked the wind from his lungs rather than shattering every bone in his body. He rolled across the grimy metal surface, coming to rest against a cluster of industrial waste containers that reeked of chemicals he didn't recognize. The portal above him. A swirling mandala of golden energy that had carried him from the Sanctum Sanctorum through the space between dimensions, collapsed inward with a sound like thunder played backwards. Strange reached up instinctively, his trembling hands tracing symbols in the air, attempting to reopen the gateway. Orange sparks flickered around his fingers, but the portal refused to form. The familiar tug of the dark dimension's energy, the cosmic forces he'd learned to channel through years of training under the Ancient One, felt distant. Muted. The air if needed. The apparent leader of the group, a scarred human woman with a blaster pistol, responded in that same alien language, her tone making her intentions clear even without translation. These weren't welcoming committee members. Strange's fingers traced a quick pattern, and a shield of golden energy materialized before him just as the first blaster bolt streaked through the air. The red energy bolt struck his shield and dissipated, but Strange felt the spell waver, requiring more effort to maintain than it should have. His connection to the mystical energy sources he relied upon felt attenuated, stretched thin across whatever impossible distance separated him from his home dimension. The attackers spread out, clearly experienced in combat situations. Strange counted 6 of them, poor odds even with magic. His photographic memory raced through tactical options while his hands wove another spell. The mirror dimension would be ideal, trapping them in a reflected reality where he could manipulate the environment at will. But when he attempted to push through into that parallel space, the familiar sensation of reality peeling away simply didn't occur. The spell fizzled, leaving only a few sparks of orange energy that faded into nothing. "That's not good," Strange said to himself. A second volley of blaster fire forced him to dodge, the cloak yanking him sideways as energy bolts scorched the durasteel where he'd been standing. Whatever these weapons were, they weren't based on gunpowder or conventional ballistics. Pure energy, contained and directed with disturbing precision. Strange threw a blast of eldritch energy at the nearest attacker, watching the orange bolt strike the woman in the chest and send her sprawling. At least his combat spells still functioned, even if they felt like shadows of their normal potency. A roar of engines overhead drew everyone's attention. A sleek vehicle, larger than the civilian speeders. Something that shouldn't exist in any reality he'd encountered. The technology level was clearly advanced, but the weapons relied on directed energy rather than the reality-warping science he'd seen from civilizations like the Kree or Skrull. I need to speak with whoever's in charge here. There's been a dimensional incident. Dimensional? The soldier exchanged glances with his companions. Sir, I think you might have hit your head in the fall. We should get you to a medical center for evaluation. Before Strange could protest, a new presence made itself known. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a pressure against his consciousness that reminded him of the Ancient One's aura but fundamentally different. Where the Ancient One's presence had been like standing near an open door to infinite possibilities, this felt more organic, more alive. Like the universe itself had briefly turned its attention toward him. Two figures descended from the Republic vehicle, and Strange's analytical mind immediately categorized them as separate from the soldiers. They wore robes, one in brown, the other in tan, and moved with a fluid grace that spoke of extensive martial training. The brown-robed figure was male, human, with a neat beard and sharp blue eyes that studied Strange with barely concealed curiosity. The other, a female Tigrota with distinctive head tails and white facial markings, kept her hand near a cylindrical object attached to her belt. Commander, we'll take it from here, the bearded man said, his voice carrying an authority that made the armored soldiers immediately step back. He approached Strange with measured steps, hands visible and non-threatening. My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is Ahsoka Tano. We're Jedi Knights, and we'd very much like to know how someone appeared in Coruscant's industrial district without triggering a single sensor. Strange met his gaze steadily. The word Jedi meant nothing to him, but the way this Kenobi carried himself reminded Strange of martial artists he'd encountered, disciplined, centered, and dangerous despite the apparent calm. Dr. Stephen Strange. And to answer your question, I didn't arrive by any method your sensors would recognize. I fell through a tear in dimensional space. Ahsoka's hand moved fractionally closer to her belt weapon. That's not possible. The Force doesn't work that way. The Force? Strange raised an eyebrow. I have no idea what that is. Where I come from, we call it the mystic arts. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka exchanged a look that spoke volumes, concern, confusion, and something that might have been alarm. The bearded Jedi stepped closer, and Strange felt that strange pressure intensify, as if Kenobi was somehow examining him without using any of his physical senses. You're not Force-sensitive, Obi-Wan said slowly, and his tone suggested this was somehow impossible given what he'd just witnessed. But I felt you use something. Energy that wasn't the Force. He paused, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Dr. Strange, I think you'd better come with us. The Jedi Council is going to want to hear about this. Strange considered his options. He was stranded in an unknown dimension with his powers functioning at partial capacity at best. These Jedi, whatever they were, seemed to be some form of peacekeeping force with abilities that brushed against the mystical. They also appeared to be his best chance at understanding where he'd landed and, more importantly, finding a way home. Lead the way, Strange said, allowing the cloak of levitation to settle more comfortably around his shoulders. Though I should warn you, where I come from, councils and I don't always see eye to eye. Ahsoka smiled slightly at that, the first sign of warmth from either Jedi. Master Kenobi knows all about that. As they boarded the Republic vehicle and lifted off into Coruscant's endless traffic lanes, Strange looked out at the alien cityscape and felt the weight of his situation settle over him. He'd faced demons, dark gods, and the collapse of reality itself. But he'd always had the Sanctum Sanctorum to return to, always had Earth as his anchor point. Now he was alone in a galaxy that operated on rules he didn't understand, surrounded by warriors who wielded a force his magic couldn't quite touch, and with no clear path home. The real challenge was just beginning. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The Jedi Temple rose from Coruscant's surface like a mountain of ancient authority, its 5 spires reaching toward the sky with a grandeur that rivaled anything Strange had seen on Earth. As the Republic gunship approached the massive structure, he studied its architecture with a surgeon's eye for detail, the way sunlight reflected off its polished stone surfaces, the geometric precision of its construction, the sense of timeless permanence it projected. This was a place built to endure, to stand as a symbol of something greater than itself. Impressive, Strange murmured as they descended toward a landing platform jutting from the temple's main structure. It stood for over 1,000 generations, Obi-Wan said, a note of pride in his voice. The Jedi Order has been the Republic's guardians of peace and justice for longer than most civilizations have existed. Strange caught the emphasis on peace and justice and filed it away. Every organization claimed noble purposes. The Ancient One had taught him to judge institutions by their actions, not their mission statements. As the gunship settled onto the platform with barely a whisper of repulsor engines, he prepared himself for what would likely be an interrogation dressed up as a diplomatic meeting. The interior of the temple proved as impressive as its exterior. Vast hallways stretched in multiple directions, their walls adorned with art and artifacts that spoke of countless worlds and cultures. Jedi moved through these corridors with purposeful calm, some human, many decidedly not. Strange catalogued species he'd never encountered, beings with tentacles where faces should be, humanoids with skin in shades that ranged from blue to red, creatures that defied easy categorization. Each wore variations of the same robes he'd seen on Kenobi and Ahsoka, and each moved with that same centered discipline. They ascended via a turbolift that rose through the temple's central tower, and Strange felt that strange pressure. But where I come from, the existence of parallel universes and alternate dimensions is established fact. I've personally traveled to at least a dozen different realities, encountered entities that exist outside normal spacetime, and studied under masters who taught me to perceive the fundamental structure of the multiverse. Yoda's ears twitched, a gesture Strange couldn't interpret. This force you speak of not using, yet power you have, clearly. Felt it, we did, when you arrived. A disturbance in the force, like a stone dropped in still water. The force is what you call your power, Strange said. I call mine magic, drawn from dimensional energy. They're different systems operating on different principles. Surely in a galaxy of millions of worlds, you've encountered different forms of supernatural ability. The force is in all things, Mace Windu said firmly. It binds the galaxy together. Light and dark, life and death, all connected through its energy. There is no other source of power. Strange felt his patience wearing thin. This was the problem with dogmatic institutions, they built entire philosophies around their understanding of reality and became blind to anything that contradicted their worldview. With respect, Master Windu, I just demonstrated otherwise. Unless you're suggesting I'm somehow using this force of yours unconsciously. Yoda closed his eyes, and Strange felt that pressure intensify dramatically. It was like standing in the beam of a cosmic spotlight, as if the ancient Jedi was peering into the deepest levels of his being. Strange instinctively raised his mental shields, techniques the Ancient One had taught him to protect his mind from psychic intrusion. The pressure increased, testing those defenses, then withdrew. Strange, you are, Yoda said, and Strange couldn't tell if it was an observation or a pun. In the Force, present you are. All living things are. But through it, you do not channel power. Something else, you use. You feel it, don't you? Ahsoka asked, watching him with those unervingly perceptive eyes. The Force is strong here. Strongest anywhere in the galaxy, except perhaps on ancient worlds where the Jedi first learned to listen to it. I feel something, Strange admitted. But it's not like any mystical energy I've encountered. It's more. He searched for the right words. Organic. Alive. Like it has its own consciousness. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka exchanged another of those meaningful looks. The Force does guide us, Kenobi said carefully. Whether it's truly conscious or simply the natural flow of energy through all living things is a question the Jedi have debated for millennia. But you said you use something different. These mystic arts. The mystic arts draw power from dimensional energy sources, Strange explained, choosing his words carefully. How did you explain the multiverse to people who apparently didn't know it existed? There are dimensions beyond normal space. Realms of pure energy, domains ruled by entities of immense power. Sorcerers learn to channel that energy, to shape reality according to specific patterns and laws. But here. He gestured vaguely. The connections I rely on feel distant. Whatever dimensional structure exists in your galaxy, it's fundamentally different from Earth's reality. The turbolift doors opened onto the council chamber, and Strange's prepared explanations died in his throat. The room was circular, ringed with seats positioned to face inward. Tall windows behind each seat flooded the space with natural light, and the view beyond showed Coruscant stretching to every horizon. But what seized Strange's attention were the 12 figures occupying those seats, beings who radiated authority and power in equal measure. At the center, directly opposite the entrance, sat a small creature with green skin, long ears, and eyes that held centuries of accumulated wisdom. Something I cannot sense or understand. The ancient master's eyes opened, regarding Strange with new interest. Dangerous, this could be. Or invaluable. A female Jedi with pale skin and dark robes spoke up. The war with the Separatists grows more desperate each day. If this, sorcerer, possesses abilities the Sith cannot predict or counter, he could be a valuable asset. Or a liability we cannot afford, another council member countered. We know nothing about him, his loyalties, or his true capabilities. For all we know, he could be working with Count Dooku to undermine the Republic. Strange raised his hands in a placating gesture. I have no interest in your war. My only goal is finding a way back to my own dimension. But I'm willing to cooperate with your investigation, answer your questions, and help where I can in exchange for access to your knowledge and resources. What kind of knowledge? Mace Windu asked, his tone skeptical. Anything related to dimensional physics, space-time manipulation, or unusual cosmic phenomena, Strange replied. You've had this force for millennia, surely your scholars have studied its fundamental nature, explored its limits, experimented with its applications. That research might give me insights into the dimensional structure of your galaxy and help me find a way home. Obi-Wan stepped forward. If I may, Masters. I sensed no deception from Dr. Strange. His confusion and frustration felt genuine. And his arrival did coincide with an unusual spike in the force that our sensors detected. Whatever he is, I don't believe he's an enemy. Trust your feelings, Obi-Wan, a Nautolan Jedi with head tentacles said gently. But verify with investigation. Perhaps Dr. Strange would consent to a deeper examination. Allow a Jedi consular to study his abilities. Strange considered this. Allowing someone to study his magic was risky, the mystic arts contained knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. But he needed allies, and these Jedi seemed to be the closest thing this galaxy had to his fellow sorcerers. I'm willing to demonstrate my abilities under controlled conditions. But I won't share the deeper secrets of the mystic arts until I know more about your order and your intentions. Yoda made a humming sound that might have been approval. Fair, this is. Trust, earned it must be, not demanded. Master Kenobi, oversee this you will. Learn what you can about our visitor. Report back to the council you shall. And what of his request for access to our archives? Mace Windu asked. We cannot simply allow an outsider to browse our most sensitive research. Supervised access, Yoda decided. Knowledge of the Force, he may study. But secrets of the Jedi, protected they must remain. Understand this, Dr. Strange, do you? Perfectly, Strange said. It was more than he'd hoped for, honestly. Diplomatic negotiations were not his strong suit, but he recognized a reasonable compromise when he saw one. I appreciate the Council's consideration. One more thing, Mace Windu said, his gaze intense. This war we're fighting, it's not a simple conflict. The Separatists claim they seek independence from the Republic, but they're led by a fallen Jedi who has embraced the dark side of the Force. Count Dooku is dangerous, cunning, and would not hesitate to use you if given the chance. While you're on Coruscant, under Republic protection, you're safe. But if you leave the temple or venture into the war, you become a target. Strange met his gaze steadily. Master Windu, I've faced demons that eat souls for breakfast, dark gods who erase universes on a whim, and a living embodiment of entropy itself. I think I can handle one fallen wizard. Dr. Stephen Strange, the creature said, his voice gravelly but clear despite his apparent age. Come, you will. Much to discuss, we have. Strange walked to the center of the circle, acutely aware of 12 pairs of eyes focused on him with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and calculation. The cloak of levitation shifted nervously around his shoulders, responding to his tension. He'd stood before the Vishanti themselves, faced the judgment of cosmic entities that could unmake reality with a thought. He would not be intimidated by a council, no matter how imposing their presence. Grand Master Yoda, Obi-Wan said, bowing respectfully. Master Windu, esteemed council members. We found Dr. Strange in the industrial district after he materialized without any hyperspace signature or sensor warning. He claims to have arrived via dimensional travel. A dark-skinned human with a shaved head and an aura of controlled intensity leaned forward. His robes were darker than the others, and his presence felt sharp, focused like a blade held at ready. Dimensional travel. The Force doesn't permit such things. Perhaps you're a Sith trick, sent to infiltrate the temple during wartime. Master Windu, Strange said evenly, I don't know what a Sith is, and I'm certainly no one's trick. I'm a sorcerer from Earth. A planet that, I'm beginning to suspect, exists in an entirely different reality than your galaxy. I was attempting to seal a multiversal breach when something went wrong and I was pulled through into your dimension. Earth, a Saurian with an elongated cranium repeated thoughtfully. No planet by that name exists in Republic records. And we have catalogued millions of worlds. Because it's not in your galaxy, Strange said, struggling to keep frustration from his voice. Look, I understand this is difficult to accept. Several council members stiffened at the casual dismissal, but Strange caught a glimmer of amusement in Yoda's ancient eyes. The Grand Master stood, using a gnarled walking stick for support despite the obvious strength still present in his small frame. Time will tell, it will, Yoda said. For now, guest of the temple you are, Dr. Strange. Learn about us, we will learn about you. And perhaps, understanding we shall find. The council session ended with that ambiguous promise. As Obi-Wan led Strange from the chamber, Ahsoka fell into step beside them, her expression thoughtful. You handled that well, she said. Most people are intimidated by the council. I've stood before cosmic judges who could blink me out of existence, Strange replied. Your council, while impressive, doesn't quite compare. Obi-Wan smiled slightly. I think you and I are going to have some very interesting conversations, Dr. Strange. Come. I'll show you the quarters and then we can begin your introduction to the Force. And I can begin my introduction to the galaxy I've accidentally invaded, Strange said, looking out through one of the temple's vast windows at the endless cityscape beyond. Somewhere out there in this strange new reality, there had to be a way home. He just had to find it. But as he followed the two Jedi deeper into the temple, Strange couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival here wasn't quite as accidental as he'd thought. The way that portal had torn open, the precision with which he'd been deposited in this specific galaxy at this specific time, it felt orchestrated. Purposeful. Someone or something had wanted him here. The question was, why? The quarters assigned to Strange were surprisingly spacious, a meditation room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the temple district, a small sleeping chamber with a bed designed for humanoid physiology, and a refresher unit whose functions he'd had to have Ahsoka explain. The simplicity appealed to him. After years in the sanctum sanctorum surrounded by artifacts and relics, the clean minimalism of Jedi accommodations felt almost refreshing. He spent the first hour attempting to establish contact with the sanctum, drawing complex mandalas of power in the air with movements his damaged hands had long since memorized. Each spell fizzled or produced only weak echoes of their normal effects. The dimensional barriers separating him from Earth weren't just distant, they were fundamentally incompatible with his magical framework. It was like trying to make a phone call when the entire telecommunications infrastructure operated on technology that hadn't been invented yet. A knock at the door interrupted his fourth failed attempt to open a portal. Strange dismissed the fading golden sparks with an irritated gesture and called out, "It's open." Obi-Wan entered, now wearing more practical clothing beneath his robes. Fitted pants, boots designed for combat, and a utility belt that held his lightsaber and various other equipment. He carried a data pad under one arm and 2 cups of something that steamed gently. "I thought you might appreciate some CAF," Kenobi said, offering one of the cups. "It's the closest thing we have to your Earth coffee, I suspect. Bitter, caffeinated, and essential for long conversations." Strange accepted the cup gratefully, taking a cautious sip. The taste was indeed similar to coffee, though with an almost nutty undertone that wasn't unpleasant. "Thank you. And thank you for advocating for me with the council. I got the sense Master Windu would have preferred to lock me in a cell until he figured out what to do with me. Whatever disabled their defenses might not work on my spells." Ahsoka looked intrigued despite herself. "He has a point, Master. And we've all seen situations where having someone who thinks differently makes the difference between success and disaster." Obi-Wan stroked his beard, clearly torn between military pragmatism and protective instinct. "If something happens to you, the Council will have both our heads. And I don't even know what your combat capabilities are." Strange's hands moved in a swift, practiced pattern, and suddenly the meditation chair Obi-Wan had been sitting in lifted into the air, rotated 90 degrees, and settled gently back down. Orange energy crackled around Strange's fingers as he formed constructs, shields, blades, binding bands that writhed like living things. "I've fought in battles that would make your war look like a training exercise. I've held together fractured dimensions, dualed entities that eat planets, and died 14 million times to save my reality from an extinction-level threat." The casualness with which he said it made both Jedi pause. Ahsoka's eyes widened. 14 million times. "It's a long story involving time manipulation," Strange said, dismissing the magical constructs. "The point is, I can handle myself. And sitting here practicing spells that barely work while people die isn't how I operate. Never has been." Obi-Wan studied him for a long moment, and Strange felt that pressure again, the Jedi examining him not with eyes but with something deeper. Finally, Kenobi nodded. "Against my better judgment, I agree. But you follow orders in the field, you don't take unnecessary risks, and if I tell you to retreat, you retreat. Understood?" "Perfectly," Strange lied. The Ancient One had taught him that sometimes the unnecessary risk was the only option that mattered. 20 minutes later, Strange found himself. "Mace is cautious," Obi-Wan said diplomatically, settling into one of the meditation chairs. "He's been a Jedi longer than I've been alive, and he's seen what happens when the Order places trust unwisely. The war with the Separatists has made everyone more suspicious, more willing to see threats where there may be none. Tell me about this war, Strange said, sitting across from him. The Council mentioned fallen Jedi, Separatists, and something called the Dark Side. Where I come from, we have our own conflicts between light and dark magic, but I suspect your situation is more complex than simple binaries. Obi-Wan's expression grew somber. 3 years ago, thousands of star systems seceded from the Republic, claiming the government had become corrupt and ineffective. They formed the Confederacy of Independent Systems, what we call the Separatists. Their complaints weren't entirely without merit. The Republic is massive, bureaucratic, and the Senate's ability to address problems has been declining for decades. But? Strange prompted, hearing the unspoken caveat. But the movement was co-opted by Count Dooku, a former Jedi Master who fell to the dark side 20 years ago. He's turned a legitimate political grievance into a war that's tearing the galaxy apart. The Separatists deploy droid armies. Millions of automated soldiers who feel no pain, show no mercy, and can be manufactured faster than we can destroy them. The Republic responded by commissioning a clone army, and now. Obi-Wan gestured wearily. Now we Jedi, who swore to be peacekeepers, find ourselves serving as generals in a war that claims millions of lives each month. Strange heard the conflict in Kenobi's voice, the tension between duty and doubt. He'd felt similar struggles when the Ancient One had first recruited him, when he'd learned that being a sorcerer meant sometimes making impossible choices. You don't agree with your role in this war. Aboard a Republic gunship designated LAAT/, surrounded by clone troopers whose white armor gleamed under the artificial lighting. The interior was utilitarian, rows of seats designed for rapid deployment, weapons racks holding spare rifles and equipment, and a cockpit where 2 pilots guided the ship through Coruscant's traffic lanes toward the military spaceport. The clones were identical, Strange realized with a start. Not similar, identical. Same height, same build, same facial features beneath their helmets. They moved with synchronized precision, checking equipment and running pre-combat protocols with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They're all clones of the same man, Obi-Wan explained, noticing Strange's attention. Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter. The Kaminoans grew them in accelerated aging tanks and trained them from birth to be soldiers. They're loyal, skilled, and unfortunately necessary for a republic that didn't maintain a standing army before the war. Strange felt a chill run down his spine. Cloning technology existed on Earth in limited forms, but using it to mass-produce soldiers raised ethical questions that made his surgeon's mind rebel. These men were individuals, he could see it in the small variations of their posture and equipment customization, yet they'd been created purely to fight and die in someone else's war. One of the clones, his armor marked with orange stripes and a distinctive pattern, approached and saluted. "Sir, I'm Commander Cody of the 212th Attack Battalion. General Kenobi speaks highly of your abilities. Just want you to know, we've got your back out there." "I appreciate that, Commander," Strange said, returning the gesture awkwardly. "Though I'm not military, so the sir probably isn't necessary." Cody's helmet tilted slightly. "You're fighting alongside us. That makes you one of us, sir." Only reality. Imagine the universe as a building with infinite floors. Each floor is a different dimension, a different reality with its own physical laws and energy sources. The Force exists on your floor, it's the dominant supernatural power in your galaxy. But on my floor, on Earth, we have dimensional energy that can be channeled through learned patterns and will. They're similar in effect but fundamentally different in source and methodology. So you're from a different. Anakin gestured vaguely, floor. And you fell through somehow. More accurately, I was pulled through. And yes, that's essentially correct. Ahsoka, who'd been listening intently, spoke up. If there are infinite realities, doesn't that mean infinite versions of everything? Infinite versions of us? In theory, Strange said. Though most realities diverge so significantly that analogous individuals don't exist. I've never encountered another version of myself, for instance, though I've met variants of people I know. The multiverse is vast beyond comprehension. Sounds lonely, Anakin said quietly, and something in his tone made Strange look at him more carefully. There was darkness in this young man, pain buried beneath confidence and bravado. The kind of emotional wound that never fully healed. Before Strange could respond, alarms blared across the bridge. A clone officer called out urgently, "General Skywalker. We're receiving a distress signal, it's from Ord Cestus Medical Station. Audio only, signal weak and breaking up." "Put it through," Anakin ordered, his playful demeanor vanishing instantly. Static filled the bridge, punctuated by bursts of panicked voices and the unmistakable sound of weapons fire. "Overwhelming us, shields are gone, can't hold, they're boarding through the medical bays." The gunship docked with a massive star destroyer in orbit, the Negotiator, according to the hull markings Strange glimpsed through the viewport. The scale of the vessel was staggering, over a kilometer long, bristling with weapons, and carrying enough firepower to level a city. The hangar bay they entered could have held the entire Sanctum Sanctorum with room to spare. More clones moved through the hangar with purpose, loading supplies, conducting maintenance on starfighters that looked like skeletal predators, and organizing into units for deployment. Strange followed Obi-Wan and Ahsoka toward the bridge, trying to absorb the controlled chaos of a warship preparing for battle. The bridge was a marvel of technology. Holographic displays showing tactical information, crew members monitoring hundreds of systems simultaneously, and viewports that offered a staggering view of Coruscant shrinking behind them as the destroyer accelerated away from the planet. At the center of it all stood a young man with sandy hair, a mechanical right hand, and eyes that held a disturbing intensity. "Anakin," Obi-Wan greeted him warmly. "I see you've already plotted our hyperspace route." "We leave in 3 minutes," Anakin Skywalker said, his gaze flickering to Strange with obvious curiosity. "So this is the dimensional traveler everyone's talking about. You don't look like much." "Anakin," Ahsoka said warningly, but Strange waved her off. "I could say the same about you," Strange replied mildly. "Though I suspect we've both learned that appearances can be deceiving." A grin flashed across Anakin's face, transforming his intensity into something almost charming. "I like him. Anyone who doesn't immediately bow to Jedi mystique is refreshing." He extended his mechanical hand. "General Anakin Skywalker. Welcome to the 501st. I serve the Republic because the alternative is chaos," Obi-Wan said carefully. "But there are days I wonder if we've lost our way. The Jedi Code teaches detachment, compassion, and service. War demands attachment to outcomes, controlled aggression, and the willingness to take lives. It's difficult to reconcile." Before Strange could respond, Ahsoka appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "Master Kenobi, the Council Soning calling you. There's been an attack on the medical station orbiting Ord Cestus. The Separatists deployed a new weapon, something that disabled the station's shields before anyone could respond. They're requesting immediate Jedi assistance." Obi-Wan rose immediately, his earlier philosophical doubt replaced by focused determination. "How many casualties?" "Unknown. Communications were cut off mid-transmission." Ahsoka's hand rested on her lightsaber, her body language screaming readiness for action. "Master Windu is assembling a strike team. You, me, Anakin, and a battalion of the 501st. Tell them I'm on my way." Obi-Wan turned to Strange. "I apologize for cutting our conversation short." "I'm coming with you," Strange said, rising from his chair. The cloak of levitation stirred in anticipation, sensing his intent. Both Jedi stared at him. "Dr. Strange," Obi-Wan said slowly, "this is a military operation in an active war zone. You're not trained for combat in this galaxy, you don't understand our tactics or technology, and the Council would never approve. The council said I was under Republic protection while I'm here, Strange interrupted. My magic operates on different principles than your technology. The signal dissolved into screaming and then cut off entirely. The bridge fell silent. Strange saw the effect on everyone present, the clone's posture stiffening, Ahsoka's hand gripping her lightsaber, Obi-Wan's expression becoming carved from stone. These were people who'd heard too many distress calls end in silence. Time toward Cestus? Anakin asked, his voice cold and controlled. 5 hours, 18 minutes, General. Not fast enough. Anakin turned to his old master. Obi-Wan, we need to. I know, Kenobi interrupted. We'll organize rescue teams, prepare medical support, and hope we arrive before the station falls completely. It's all we can do. Strange stepped forward. There might be another option. If I could examine your hyperspace technology, understand how it interfaces with this dimension's structure, I might be able to boost your speed. My magic doesn't play well with your tech, but I've manipulated spacetime before. It's theoretically possible. Every eye on the bridge turned to him. Anakin's expression shifted from grief to cautious hope. You can make us go faster. I don't know, Strange admitted. But I can try. Where's your engine room? The hyperdrive chamber deep within the negotiator's engineering section hummed with barely contained power, a massive cylindrical construct that pulsed with blue-white energy. Strange stood before it, his mystical senses overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of what he was perceiving. The technology didn't just move the ship faster than light, it punched through into an alternate dimension where the laws of physics bent in ways that made dimensional travel look tame by comparison. This is hyperspace? Strange asked, placing his hand near the energy field but not quite touching it. Heat radiated from the drive core, and his fingers tingled with the sensation of reality being compressed and folded like origami. The chief engineer, a clone with technical expertise that belied his identical appearance to every other trooper, nodded enthusiastically. Yes, sir. The hyperdrive creates a field that shifts us into hyperspace, where the normal rules of real space don't apply. We follow mapped routes called hyperspace lanes, corridors where gravitational shadows are predictable and won't yank us back into real space. Anakin stood nearby, arms crossed, watching Strange with barely concealed impatience. Can you help or not? Every minute we waste is another minute those people are dying. Strange ignored the pressure, his mind racing through possibilities. The hyperdrive operated on principles he didn't fully understand, but the fundamental concept wasn't that different from the portal magic he'd mastered. Both involved manipulating space to create shortcuts through reality. The difference was methodology and scale. I need to see the calculations, Strange said. Your navigation data, the route you're following, the mathematical framework underlying your hyperspace physics. The engineer looked to Anakin, who nodded curtly. Within moments, holographic displays surrounded Strange, showing streams of data that would have taken years to fully comprehend. But Strange's photographic. Atmosphere venting from breached sections, and ominously, dozens of separatist ships surrounding it like predators circling prey. Tactical assessment, Anakin snapped. A clone officer responded immediately. 12 separatist frigates, 2 battleships, and what looks like a new prototype vessel, that's probably what disabled their shields. The station's defenses are offline, and we're detecting combat inside. They're boarding through multiple entry points. How many hostiles inside? Estimate 300 battle droids, maybe more. And sir, we're detecting organic life signs. The separatists have taken hostages. Anakin's jaw clenched, and Strange saw murder flash through his eyes before being forcibly controlled. We go in hard and fast. Deploy all LAAT gunships, fighter escort, and prepare boarding teams. Obi-Wan, you take the lower decks with the 212th, Ahsoka, you're with me clearing the medical wings. We rescue every civilian we can and eliminate every droid we find. "What about their ships?" the tactical officer asked. "We'll engage them with our turbolasers, but the priority is the station." Anakin turned to Strange. "You've already done more than anyone could ask, but—" "I'm going with you," Strange said. He'd caught his breath, and while his arms still trembled from magical exhaustion, his combat spells didn't require the same sustained concentration as the dimensional anchor. "You said they took hostages. I can create shields, barriers, protection that might save lives if things go bad." Ahsoka smiled. "See? I told you he'd want to come." "Fine," Anakin said. "But you stick with my team, follow Ahsoka's lead, and for the love of the Force, don't do anything stupidly heroic." Strange returned the smile. "I'll try to limit myself to reasonably heroic." The cloak of levitation wrapped around him more tightly, lending its own mystical energy to stabilize the spell. Strange felt the connection snap into place, a golden thread of power stretching forward through hyperspace, anchored to a 0.5 light-years ahead of their current position. He began pulling. The ship lurched. Alarms blared throughout the engineering section as the hyperdrive's output spiked beyond its normal parameters. The energy field surrounding the drive core flared brilliant white, and Strange felt the dimensional membrane strain under the dual stress of technological and magical manipulation. "Hyperdrive output at 140%, the engineer shouted over the alarms. "We're exceeding safe operational limits." "Can the ship handle it?" Anakin demanded. "Unknown, sir. We've never pushed this hard." "Then we're about to find out," Anakin said grimly. "How much time are we saving, Dr. Strange?" Strange's vision had gone double, one eye seeing the physical world, the other perceiving the currents of hyperspace itself. The anchor point was stable, pulling them forward at velocities that exceeded even this advanced civilization's expectations. "At this rate, we'll reach Ord Cestus in 3 hours instead of 5. Maybe less if I can maintain this." "Do it," Anakin ordered. "Whatever it takes." The next 2 hours and 43 minutes were the most exhausting of Strange's life since the incident that destroyed his hands. Maintaining the dimensional anchor required constant focus, adjusting for the subtle variations in hyperspace's structure, compensating when gravitational masses they passed created drag on his spell. His arms ached from holding the necessary gestures, his mind screamed for rest, and twice he nearly lost his grip on the construct entirely. Obi-Wan arrived in the engineering section an hour in, took one look at Strange's condition, and 20 minutes later, Strange found himself in a LAAT gunship racing toward the crippled medical station, surrounded by clone troopers checking weapons and Ahsoka reviewing the station's layout on a datapad. Through the open side doors, he could see other gunships forming up around them, and beyond, Republic starfighters engaging the Separatist vessels in brilliant displays of laser fire and explosions. "We're breaching through docking port 7, Ahsoka explained, highlighting a section of the schematic. "Intel suggests the heaviest droid presence is in the central medical bay, that's where the hostages are. We fight our way there, secure the civilians, and hold until evacuation is complete." "Simple," Strange said dryly. "Simple doesn't mean easy," Ahsoka replied. "These battle droids are relentless. They don't fear death because they're not alive. They'll keep coming until they're destroyed or their command ship is taken out." The gunship shook as it penetrated the station's damaged hull, its pilot expertly navigating through twisted metal and exposed conduits. They set down in what had been a cargo bay, now open to space and maintained only by emergency force fields that flickered ominously. The moment the gunship's doors fully opened, blaster fire erupted from the darkness beyond. Clone troopers returned fire with disciplined volleys, their training evident in every movement. Anakin and Ahsoka ignited their lightsabers, Anakin's blade burning blue, Ahsoka's twin sabers glowing green and yellow-green, and charged forward into the chaos. Strange's hands moved on instinct, centuries of muscle memory compressed into a few years of intensive training. A Tal Mandala materialized, deflecting a stream of blaster bolts that would have cut down 2 clones. He pushed forward, staying close to Ahsoka as ordered, and watched in amazement as the Jedi moved. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Lightsabers blurred through defensive patterns that seemed to predict where blaster bolts would be before they were fired, cutting through battle droids with surgical precision. Anakin fought with aggressive confidence, his blade work emphasizing power and overwhelming offense. Ahsoka was more acrobatic, using her smaller size and dual weapons to slip through enemy formations like water. But there were so many droids. They poured from side corridors and maintenance shafts, their vocabulators crackling with emotionless acknowledgments as they fired. Roger, Roger. Engaging Republic forces. Alert, Jedi detected. A thermal detonator landed near Strange, its red light blinking in rapid countdown. He reacted without thinking, creating a perfect sphere of golden energy around the explosive device. The detonation contained within the shield, all force and shrapnel absorbed harmlessly. The clones near him nodded appreciation before continuing their advance. They fought through 3 corridors, each one presenting new tactical challenges. Battle droids with riot shields. Droidekas rolling forward then deploying with their own energy shields active. Super battle droids with wrist-mounted blasters that required concentrated fire to penetrate their armor. Strange adapted his magic on the fly, learning the rhythm of this kind of combat. Eldritch whips that could rip droids apart at the joints. Binding bands that immobilized groups long enough for the clones to destroy them. Shields that protected wounded troopers while medics worked. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. They reached the central medical bay to find a scene of controlled horror. Hundreds of civilians, medical staff, patients still connected to life support, civilians who'd been seeking treatment, were huddled in the center of the vast. Immediately began something. Strange felt the pressure of the Force wrap around him, not intruding but supporting, like a gentle hand on his back helping him stay upright. It wasn't magical energy he could directly use, but it eased the physical strain, allowed him to focus more completely on the mystical component of his task. The Force cannot touch your magic, Obi-Wan said quietly, standing beside him, but it can touch you. Let it help. Trust it. Strange wanted to argue that he didn't understand this Force, didn't know how to work with it, but exhaustion made protests irrelevant. He accepted the support gratefully, feeling his endurance extend beyond what should have been possible. Ahsoka appeared with water and something the clones called ration bars. Strange ate mechanically, never breaking his concentration on the spell, barely tasting the food. The young Togruta watched him with concern but also respect. She understood pushing beyond normal limits for a mission, he could see it in her eyes. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace, emerging into real space with a violent shudder that nearly knocked Strange off his feet, he released the spell and collapsed to his knees. The cloak caught him before he hit the deck entirely, and Obi-Wan's steadying hand gripped his shoulder. "Well done," Kenobi said. "I've never seen anything quite like that." "Neither have I," Strange admitted, his voice hoarse. "And I've seen a lot." Anakin was already sprinting toward the bridge, calling out orders. Strange forced himself upright, refusing to show weakness even though his legs felt like water. He'd promised to help, and the mission wasn't over yet. The bridge viewports showed Ord Cestus, a blue-green world with extensive orbital infrastructure. The medical station hung in space like a wounded bird, lights flickering. Memory absorbed it all, pattern recognition skills honed through medical training and mystical study finding the underlying structures. There. The hyperspace route was calculated based on gravitational masses, safe corridors between stellar bodies where the dimensional membrane was thin enough to pierce. But the calculations were conservative, optimized for safety rather than speed. They assumed the ship would follow a specific path, maintain specific velocity, and emerge at a predetermined point. What if those assumptions could be bent? Strange's hands began moving, tracing patterns in the air. Golden mandalas of power materialized, mathematical symbols from Earth's mystical traditions overlaying the Galactic Republic's navigational data. He wasn't trying to change the technology, his magic couldn't interface with it directly. But he could manipulate the space around the ship, create a localized distortion that would act as a gravity well, pulling them through hyperspace faster than the drives alone could manage. "What are you doing?" the engineer asked nervously as strange spell constructs began intersecting with the hyperdrive's energy field. "Creating a dimensional anchor point ahead of your current position," Strange explained, sweat beading on his forehead from the concentration required. "Think of it as a fishing line pulling you forward through hyperspace. Your drives provide the baseline movement, my magic provides additional acceleration by manipulating the dimensional structure you're traveling through." Anakin's eyes widened. "That's either brilliant or insane." "Often the same thing," Strange muttered, refining the spell. The challenge was maintaining the anchor point while the ship was moving. It required him to constantly adjust the positioning, to feel the flow of hyperspace itself and anticipate changes. It was like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. Replied. His hands were already moving, preparing spells he hoped wouldn't be necessary. "And someone who's very good at removing cancers." Dooku smiled, and it was the smile of a teacher who'd found an interesting student. "Then perhaps we have more to discuss than I thought." "Surrender peacefully, Dr. Strange. Yes, I know your name, and I promise these civilians will be spared. Resist, and my droids will execute them all while we watch." Strange met Anakin's eyes and saw the young Jedi calculating impossible odds, weighing terrible choices. This was the kind of situation that broke people, that forced them to compromise their principles or watch innocents die. Strange had faced it before. He'd faced it 14 million times across fractured timelines. He knew exactly what had to be done. "Counter-proposal," Strange said calmly. "You leave now, or I show you why dimensional sorcerers don't negotiate with terrorists." The tension in the medical bay crystallized into a single frozen moment, Dooku's amused smile, Anakin's barely restrained fury, the hostages' terrified faces, and Strange's hands poised to unleash magic that might save everyone or doom them all. The battle droid's weapons remained trained on the civilians, fingers on triggers, waiting for the command that would turn rescue into massacre. Strange's mind raced through calculations with the same surgical precision he'd once applied to neurosurgery. 300 battle droids. 1 Sith Lord. Hundreds of hostages clustered in a kill zone. Anakin and Ahsoka could deflect blaster fire, but not from 300 sources simultaneously. The clones were excellent soldiers, but they couldn't protect everyone at once. He needed an approach that removed all variables simultaneously. "Your confidence is admirable," Dooku said, descending from the command platform with measured grace. His hand rested near the curved hilt of his lightsaber, a weapon that radiated dark energy even while deactivated. "But misplaced. I've studied the Force for over 70 years. I've faced Jedi Masters and Sith Lords. What could a dimensional traveler possibly do that would?" Strange's hand snapped through a complex pattern, and the air itself seemed to fold. The mirror dimension had been inaccessible since his arrival in this galaxy, the mystical space that existed parallel to reality refusing to respond to his calls. But that was because he'd been trying to pull himself and others into it, a massive expenditure of energy his diminished connection to dimensional power couldn't sustain. What if instead, he pulled the mirror dimension to them? Golden light exploded outward from Strange's position, and the medical bay shattered like glass. The walls, floor, and ceiling fractured into geometric fragments that reformed into an impossible kaleidoscope of reflected reality. But the spell was incomplete, selective, it caught Dooku, the droids, and Strange. Defenses layer by layer. His arms screamed in protest, the nerve damage from his accident making sustained mystical exertion agonizing. The tremor in his hands grew worse, threatening his ability to maintain the precise gestures required for complex spells. Sweat poured down his face as he poured everything he had into the shield, knowing that the moment it failed, Dooku's lightning would cook him from the inside out. Impressive resilience, Dooku observed, increasing the lightning's intensity. but ultimately futile. You cannot win, Doctor Strange. You're a fish out of water, fighting with magic that barely functions in this galaxy while I command power that has flowed through the Force for millennia. Through the crackling energy, Strange saw Anakin sprinting toward them, lightsaber raised, rage and determination written across his face. But Dooku saw him too. Without breaking his lightning assault on Strange, the Count gestured with one hand, and Anakin flew backward as if struck by an invisible giant. The young Jedi slammed into a wall hard enough to dent the durasteel. Anakin. Ahsoka's voice, filled with panic. Stay with the civilians. Anakin shouted back, already pushing himself up despite obvious pain. That's an order. Dooku's attention returned to Strange, and the lightning intensified to unbearable levels. Strange's shield fractured, cracks spreading through the golden energy like breaking glass. He had seconds at most before complete failure. In desperation, Strange did something the Ancient One had warned him never to attempt. He tried to channel the Force itself through his mystical framework. It was like trying to direct a river through a garden hose. The Force wasn't dimensional energy, it was everywhere, in everything, a living current that connected all things. It didn't want to be channeled, shaped, or directed according to mystical patterns. It wanted to flow naturally, to guide rather than be guided. Himself, while leaving the hostages, Anakin, Ahsoka, and the clone troopers in normal space. Dooku stumbled, his practiced composure cracking for the first time. The battle droids spun in confusion as the world around them twisted into recursive reflections, their simple programming unable to process an environment that defied fundamental physics. 300 droids found themselves scattered across a geometric maze where up and down became suggestions rather than rules. What sorcery? Dooku began, igniting his crimson lightsaber. Strange didn't give him time to finish. The mirror dimension responded to his will like clay in a sculptor's hands. The floor beneath Dooku's feet rippled and rose, becoming a wall. That wall curved into a sphere, then fragmented into 1,000 mirrors each showing the Count from different angles. Strange pulled at the geometry, forcing Dooku to defend himself not from an attacker but from an environment that actively sought to contain him. This is a space between spaces, Strange called out, his voice echoing from multiple directions simultaneously. A dimension where reality answers to trained will. Your Force works here, but you've never learned to manipulate dimensional structure. I have. Dooku slashed at the mirrors surrounding him, his lightsaber cutting through reflected surfaces that simply reformed behind the blade. Impressive. But ultimately futile. The fallen Jedi closed his eyes, and Strange felt the dark side surge. Force lightning erupted from Dooku's fingertips, crackling blue-white energy that struck the mirrors and began spreading through the geometric structure like cracks through ice. The mirror dimension shrieked under the assault, its stability compromised by an energy Strange's magic hadn't accounted for. Where lightning touched, the reflective surfaces darkened and corrupted, Dooku's power infecting the dimensional space itself. Strange gritted his teeth, pouring more energy into maintaining the construct. But his depleted connection to dimensional power was showing its limits. The mirror dimension was collapsing faster than he could reinforce it, especially with Dooku actively working to shatter it from within. In normal space, Anakin was already moving. The moment Dooku and the droids vanished into Strange fractured reality, the young Jedi had sprinted toward the hostages, his lightsaber cutting through the containment field generators. Ahsoka, get them to the evacuation ships. Cody, cover their retreat. The clone commander's voice rang out. You heard the general. Troopers, defensive perimeter. Move, move, move. But Strange couldn't focus on the evacuation. Dooku had adapted to the mirror dimension with terrifying speed, using the Force to sense the dimensional structure's weak points and exploiting them. The Count's lightsaber carved through a supporting angle, and an entire section of the geometric prison collapsed. Battle droids began to reorient, their targeting systems locking onto Strange despite the environmental chaos. Blaster fire filled the mirror dimension, bolts ricocheting off mirrors in unpredictable patterns. Strange threw up a shield, deflecting the shots, but the divided attention was too much. He couldn't maintain the dimensional prison and defend himself simultaneously. The mirror dimension shattered completely. Reality snapped back with force that knocked Strange off his feet. The medical bay reformed around them, but crucially, the battle droids were now scattered throughout the massive room rather than concentrated around the hostages. Strange's incomplete spell had bought them exactly what they needed, time and positioning. Dooku landed gracefully, his cape settling around him as if nothing unusual had occurred. Clever. You separated my forces and disrupted our tactical advantage. But you've also exhausted yourself, haven't you? I can see it in your trembling hands, the sweat on your brow. Whatever power you command. Strange made the decision for him. Let him go. The hostages need you here more than Dooku needs to be chased. He'll kill more people, Anakin said through gritted teeth. Every day we let him escape is another day of death. And today, we saved hundreds, Strange replied. That has to count for something. For a long moment, Anakin stood frozen between choices. Then his shoulders sagged, and he deactivated his lightsaber. You're right. I hate it, but you're right. He turned to the clone troopers. Status report. All hostages secured and evacuating, sir, Commander Cody reported. We've destroyed 90% of the battle droids. Remaining units are in retreat toward their ships. Station life support is failing in sections 3 through 7, but we can stabilize the rest. Ahsoka approached, her expression relieved but concerned. That thing you did, the shield that wasn't just magic. What was that? Strange slumped against a support pillar, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Something dangerous that I shouldn't try again. I forced the Force to behave like dimensional energy. It worked, but it felt like trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole made of antimatter. The Force doesn't like being forced, Ahsoka said with a slight smile at the wordplay. It guides those who let it. Trying to control it, that's a path to the dark side. Good thing I'm not Force sensitive, then, Strange replied. Though privately, he wondered if that was still entirely true. For a moment, he'd felt the Force respond to his will. Not naturally, not like the Jedi did, but respond nonetheless. The implications were troubling. Obi-Wan arrived with his own team of clones, his robes singed and his face smudged with carbon scoring. Dooku escaped. Yes, Anakin said flatly. Again. But we saved the hostages, Obi-Wan said, surveying the medical bay. His gaze settled on Strange with new respect. I felt what you did. That dimensional prison, I've never experienced anything like it. It was as if reality itself had been rewritten. That's essentially what happened, Strange confirmed. Though calling it a success would be generous. Dooku adapted too quickly, and I nearly exhausted myself maintaining it. Yet you held him long enough for us to evacuate the civilians and destroy his droid forces, Kenobi pointed out. I'd call that a success by any reasonable measure. Strange wanted to argue, to point out all the ways the encounter could have gone better, but a commotion near the evacuation point drew everyone's attention. A group of medical staff was surrounding someone, their urgent voices carrying across the bay. We need a Jedi healer, now. She's going into cardiac arrest. Ahsoka sprinted toward them, but Strange was already moving, the physician in him overriding exhaustion. He pushed through the crowd to find a young Twi'lek woman. Blue-skinned with distinctive head tails, convulsing on a medical stretcher. The life support equipment she'd been connected to was sparking and damaged, probably from the battle. The medical staff looked at him with desperate hope. Are you a healer? She has a congenital heart defect, the battle droids destroyed her life support before we could evacuate her. She needs surgery, but our operating theater is depressurized and... I'm a doctor, Strange said, his hands already moving to assess her condition. Years of medical training flooded back, muscle memory and diagnostic instinct overriding mystical exhaustion. Congenital heart defect, you said? What kind? Ventricular septal defect with associated pulmonary hypertension, the lead medic said. She needs a surgical repair, but... I've performed that surgery hundreds of times, Strange interrupted. His hands were already glowing with golden energy, mystical healing techniques combining with. It's not infinite. Strange pushed himself upright, the cloak of levitation helping stabilize him. Dooku was right, that spell had drained reserves he couldn't afford to lose. But it had worked. Behind the Count, he could see clone troopers systematically destroying the disoriented battle droids while Ahsoka and others shepherded hostages toward the escape routes. I don't need infinite power, Strange said, his hands already moving into another pattern. I just need enough. Crimson bands of Sidorak materialized, thick bands of mystical energy that had once bound gods, wrapping around Dooku like serpents. The Count's eyes widened in genuine surprise as the bands constricted, pinning his arms and lightsaber to his sides. For a moment, Strange dared to hope the spell would hold. Then Dooku smiled. The Force exploded outward from the fallen Jedi like a shockwave. Strange felt it hit him. Not physical impact but pure telekinetic pressure that drove him backward and sent his concentration scattering. The crimson bands shattered, their mystical structure unable to withstand an energy source they weren't designed to contain. Your magic is formidable, Dooku said, walking forward with casual menace. Lightning crackled around his hands. But it relies on rules, patterns, techniques learned from books and teachers. It is emotion made manifest, passion turned to power. Your bindings cannot hold what has no form. He thrust both hands forward, and Force lightning consumed the space between them. Strange barely got a shield up in time. The Tau Mandala formed from pure instinct, golden energy meeting blue-white lightning in a contest of fundamental forces. But this wasn't like Dooku's earlier attack on the mirror dimension, this was focused, concentrated, and backed by decades of mastery. The lightning clawed at Strange's shield, finding weak points, burning through his. And Anakin approaching with murder in his eyes. The Count's strategic mind made its calculation in an instant. Another time, young Skywalker, Dooku said, his voice carrying that same disappointed teacher tone. And you, Dr. Strange, you've proven far more interesting than anticipated. Lord Sidious will want to know about you. He raised his hand, and the weapon on the command platform, the shield-disrupting device, began to glow with ominous red light. No! Anakin shouted, Force sprinting toward the platform. But Strange was faster. His hands traced a pattern he'd used once before, during the battle on Titan against Thanos. A portal opened directly in front of the device just as it discharged, and the red energy beam shot through the dimensional gateway. Strange redirected the portal's exit point, and the beam emerged from a second portal he'd opened behind the Separatist frigates outside. The deadly energy that should have disabled the station's remaining defenses instead struck a Separatist ship, its shields collapsing under the weapon's own power. The frigate immediately became a target for Republic starfighters, which swarmed it like predators sensing weakness. Dooku's eyes narrowed. Remarkable. Then he did something Strange didn't expect, he bowed. It was shallow, barely an acknowledgement, but genuine. Until we meet again, Sorcerer. The Count's escape was almost artistic in its efficiency. A thermal detonator dropped at his feet filled the area with smoke and fire. When the flames cleared, Dooku was gone, a small personal craft visible through the viewport, racing away from the station with speed that suggested illegal modifications. Anakin started to give pursuit orders, then stopped, looking at the still evacuating hostages. The conflict on his face was painful to witness. The desire for vengeance warring with the duty to protect. I felt what you did. That dimensional prison, I've never experienced anything like it. It was as if reality itself had been rewritten. That's essentially what happened, Strange confirmed. though calling it a success would be generous. Dooku adapted too quickly, and I nearly exhausted myself maintaining it. Yet you held him long enough for us to evacuate the civilians and destroy his droid forces, Kenobi pointed out. I'd call that a success by any reasonable measure. Strange wanted to argue, to point out all the ways the encounter could have gone better, but a commotion near the evacuation point drew everyone's attention. A group of medical staff was surrounding someone, their urgent voices carrying across the bay. We need a Jedi healer, now. She's going into cardiac arrest. Ahsoka sprinted toward them, but Strange was already moving, the physician in him overriding exhaustion. He pushed through the crowd to find a young Twi'lek woman. Blue-skinned with distinctive head tails, convulsing on a medical stretcher. The life support equipment she'd been connected to was sparking and damaged, probably from the battle. The medical staff looked at him with desperate hope. Are you a healer? She has a congenital heart defect. The battle droids destroyed her life support before we could evacuate her. She needs surgery, but our operating theater is depressurized and... I'm a doctor, Strange said, his hands already moving to assess her condition. Years of medical training flooded back, muscle memory and diagnostic instinct overriding mystical exhaustion. Congenital heart defect, you said? What kind? Ventricular septal defect with associated pulmonary hypertension, the lead medic said. She needs a surgical repair, but... I've performed that surgery hundreds of times, Strange interrupted. His hands were already glowing with golden energy, mystical healing techniques combining with surgical knowledge. Keep her stable. I need 2 minutes. What followed was the most precise spellwork Strange had attempted since arriving in this galaxy. His trembling hands traced patterns in the air above the Twi'lek's chest, mystical energy penetrating her skin without cutting, isolating the damaged heart tissue, and repairing the defect with the same skill he'd once applied with scalpels and sutures. The magic responded to his medical expertise, guided by years of training that had made him the best neurosurgeon in New York and now made him a surgeon who didn't need to cut. The woman's convulsions stopped. Her breathing stabilized. The medical equipment that was still functioning showed her heart rhythm returning to normal. Strange pulled back, swaying from exhaustion, and found himself supported by Ahsoka's steadying hand. The medical staff stared at him with something approaching awe. That was... The lead medic struggled for words. I've seen Jedi healing, but that was surgical precision. You repaired the defect itself, not just stabilized her. I was a surgeon before I was a sorcerer, Strange said simply. Some skills you never lose. As the medical staff carefully moved the now stable patient toward the evacuation ships, Strange allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Dooku had escaped, the battle had been messy, and he'd nearly killed himself trying to combine magic and the Force. But hundreds of people were alive who would have been dead without his intervention. Perhaps this galaxy wasn't so different from Earth after all. The tools might be different, the powers might be strange, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: protect those who couldn't protect themselves and push back against the darkness wherever it appeared. Anakin approached, his earlier anger replaced with something almost like respect. The Council is going to hear about this. All of it. They'll probably have questions. They always do, Strange said wearily. But let them wait until after I've slept for about 12 hours. Dimensional manipulation, combat with a Sith Lord, and emergency surgery are not a combination I recommend for anyone's daily schedule. Obi-Wan smiled. Welcome to the Clone Wars, Dr. Strange. I suspect you'll find there's never a shortage of impossible situations requiring impossible solutions. Strange looked out at the damaged medical station, at the clone troopers helping evacuate the last civilians, at the Jedi who wielded power he didn't fully understand, and at the vast galaxy beyond that operated on rules he was only beginning to comprehend. Then I suppose, he said quietly, it's fortunate I specialize in the impossible. The debriefing chamber in the Jedi Temple was smaller than the Council chamber, designed for tactical reviews rather than formal judgments. Strange sat at a circular table surrounded by Obi-Wan, Anakin, Ahsoka, Mace Windu, and a holographic projection of Master Yoda, who had remained on Coruscant during the mission. Outside the tall windows, the city planet's endless traffic streams glowed in the twilight, a reminder that life continued regardless of the battles fought in orbit above distant worlds. Strange had managed 6 hours of sleep before being summoned, which was apparently 5 hours more than most Jedi got between missions. His body still ached from the magical exertion, and his hands trembled slightly, a combination of nerve damage and dimensional energy depletion. But his mind was sharp, analyzing the mission with the same critical eye he'd once applied to surgical complications. "Your intervention was unorthodox," Mace Windu said, reviewing a datapad that presumably contained the mission reports. "Effective, but unorthodox. This dimensional prison you created, could you replicate it?" "In theory," Strange replied. "In practice, it requires enormous energy reserves and concentration I don't currently have access to. In my dimension, I can draw power from sources that don't exist here. The spell I used at Ord Cestus was already stretched beyond safe parameters. Yet you also attempted to channel the Force itself through your magic," Windu continued, his tone harder. "That concerns me greatly, Dr. Strange. The Force is not a tool to be manipulated by those who don't understand it." Attempting to force it, he emphasized the word with dry irony. "To behave according to mystical principles foreign to its nature is dangerous." "I'm aware," Strange said evenly. "It felt like trying to contain a nuclear reaction with paper walls. I won't attempt it again unless there's literally no alternative." Yoda's hologram flickered slightly. "Understand the Force." Anakin stood at the center, manipulating a three-dimensional projection of the Raxus system with casual gestures. Rex, the clone Captain Strange had briefly met during the evacuation, stood beside him, along with several other specialized troopers. "Good, you're here," Anakin said without preamble. "I've been reviewing the facility's schematics, which are frustratingly incomplete. What we know, it's underground, heavily guarded, and using power signatures consistent with experimental technology. What we don't know, how many personnel, what specific research they're conducting, or what defenses they've implemented since our intelligence was gathered. In other words," Strange said dryly, "we're going in blind." "Welcome to Special Operations," Rex replied with what might have been humor beneath his professional demeanor. "We've refined going in blind to an art form." Anakin highlighted a section of the facility. "This is our entry point. A maintenance tunnel that should be lightly guarded. Once inside, we split into 2 teams. Rex takes a demolition squad to plant charges at structural weak points. Strange, Ahsoka, and I infiltrate the research wing, assess the threat, and determine what data needs to be preserved versus destroyed." "And if we're discovered?" Ahsoka asked. "We fight our way out," Anakin said simply. "The shuttle will be on standby for emergency extraction. Not ideal, but Raxus is deep in separatist space. We can't exactly call for backup." Strange studied the hologram, his tactical mind identifying problems. "This maintenance tunnel, why would it be lightly guarded? If I were designing security for a sensitive research facility, I'd assume infiltration attempts would use exactly that kind of entry point." "Because it's not actually a maintenance tunnel," Anakin said with a grin. "It's a waste disposal chute. Extremely unpleasant, completely automated." "Then perhaps," Obi-Wan said with a slight smile, "you need to stop trying to use what you had and start adapting to what you have. The best warriors aren't those with the most powerful weapons, they're the ones who can fight effectively with whatever tools are available." Strange returned the smile. "Is that Jedi wisdom or personal experience?" "Both," Obi-Wan replied. "I've fought Sith lords with a blaster when my lightsaber was destroyed, negotiated peace treaties when military force was expected, and survived situations where by all logic I should have died. Adaptation, Dr. Strange, is often more valuable than raw power." They were interrupted by Ahsoka, who approached with her usual energetic stride. Master Kenobi, Dr. Strange, sorry to interrupt, but Anakin wants to review the mission plan before tomorrow. He's in the tactical center if you're available. Of course, Obi-Wan said, rising. Duty calls, as always. As they walked back toward the temple's interior, Strange reflected on the conversation. Obi-Wan was right, he'd been trying to force his magic to work as it had on Earth, becoming frustrated when dimensional energy refused to flow properly. But what if he approached the problem differently? What if instead of drawing power from distant dimensions, he learned to work with the Force itself, not as a Jedi would, but as a sorcerer adapting mystical principles to a new energy source? The idea was both exciting and terrifying. It would require abandoning techniques he'd spent years mastering, rebuilding his approach to magic from first principles. But Strange had done it before, when the Ancient One first taught him that reality was malleable, that the rules he'd learned as a surgeon were merely suggestions. He could do it again. The tactical center was a room filled with holographic displays showing star charts, fleet positions, and intelligence reports. You asked earlier what the dark side is, Obi-Wan said, settling onto a stone bench. Let me try to explain properly. The Force has two aspects, light and dark. The light side comes from peace, serenity, and connection. It asks us to release our attachments, our fears, our anger. To become empty vessels through which the Force can flow naturally. And the dark side? Strange prompted, sitting across from him. The dark side comes from passion, from emotion intensified beyond natural bounds. Fear becomes terror. Anger becomes rage. Love becomes obsessive possession. It offers power in exchange for control. You force the Force to obey your will rather than flowing with it. That's why it's called the dark side. Not because it's evil by nature, but because it blinds those who use it to anything beyond their own desires. Strange thought about this carefully. In my dimension, we have similar concepts. Dark magic isn't inherently evil, it's magic drawn from dark dimensions or entities. But using it without proper safeguards, without maintaining your sense of self and purpose, leads to corruption. The power changes you, makes you willing to sacrifice more and more for greater effects. Exactly, Obi-Wan said. And that's why I'm concerned about Anakin. Strange looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Anakin is the most powerful Jedi I've ever known, Obi-Wan said quietly. Perhaps the most powerful who's ever lived. But power without wisdom is dangerous. He's passionate, emotional, and increasingly willing to bend rules he sees as obstacles. The Council worries that the war is pushing him toward the dark side, that each moral compromise, each use of anger in battle, brings him closer to falling as Dooku did. And you want me to, what? Watch him? Report to you? No, Obi-Wan said firmly. I want you to be his friend. You're not part of the Jedi Order, not bound by our codes or... He looked at Strange, you'll accompany them. Me? Strange raised an eyebrow. I'm not a soldier in your war. No, but you're the only person in the galaxy who understands dimensional science, Windu replied. If this facility is researching dimensional technology, we need you to assess the threat level and determine what needs to be destroyed. Plus, if they've made any breakthroughs, you'll recognize it immediately. And if I refuse? Then we'll destroy the facility without your expertise, Windu said bluntly. But we won't know what we're destroying or what consequences might follow. You've already stated your philosophy, protect people who can't protect themselves. Well, the entire galaxy can't protect itself from dimensional threats it doesn't understand. Strange wanted to argue, to point out that he was still trying to find a way home, that getting more involved in this war pulled him further from his own dimension. But Windu was right, if the Separatists were experimenting with dimensional science without proper knowledge, the results could be catastrophic. He'd spent years as Sorcerer Supreme preventing exactly this kind of reckless experimentation on Earth. Fine, Strange said. But I want full access to their research once we're there. If they've discovered something about this galaxy's dimensional structure, it might help me find a way home. Agreed, Yoda said. But careful, you must be. Raxus is heart of Separatist territory. Discovery means death, or worse, capture. And Dooku now knows of your existence. Prepared for you, he will be. When do we leave? Anakin asked, already mentally preparing for the mission. Tomorrow at dawn, Mace Windu said. This is a stealth operation, not a frontal assault. You'll be using a appropriated Separatist shuttle with forged credentials. If you're discovered, the Republic will disavow all knowledge of the mission. Through being where the fighting was thickest. Strange had seen similar expressions on emergency room doctors who couldn't handle being relegated to administrative duties. What assignment? Anakin asked, his tone barely controlled. Yoda's hologram expanded, and a star chart appeared beside him, highlighting a system Strange didn't recognize. Intelligence received we have, from a source deep within Separatist territory. A facility on Raxus, the Separatist capital, conducting research. Research into dimensional technology. Strange sat up straighter. Dimensional technology? They've been studying dimensional physics. Not before, Obi-Wan said. Which is why this intelligence is concerning. According to our source, the research began approximately 1 week ago, shortly after your arrival in our galaxy. The Separatists detected the dimensional disturbance you created and have been attempting to understand and replicate it. The implications hit Strange like a physical blow. His arrival had created a ripple effect, introducing concepts this galaxy hadn't considered. Now the Separatists, led by someone as intelligent and ruthless as Dooku appeared to be, were trying to weaponize dimensional science. That's catastrophic, Strange said flatly. If they figure out how to open dimensional portals without proper safeguards, they could unleash entities or energies that would make this war look like a minor dispute. I've seen dimensions where reality itself is hostile to biological life, where thought and matter are indistinguishable, where things exist that would drive entire populations insane just by being perceived. Which is why we're sending a team to investigate and, if necessary, destroy this facility, Mace Windu said. Anakin, you'll lead the mission. Take Ahsoka and a select team of clones. And, he looked at Strange. Allies we need, and understanding breeds alliance stronger than convenience. Strange considered this carefully. Teaching the Jedi about dimensional magic could give them tools they'd never considered. But it could also expose them to dangers they weren't equipped to handle. The mystic arts weren't just techniques, they were gateways to realities that could corrupt or destroy the unprepared. I'm willing to share general principles, Strange said slowly. But there are aspects of the mystic arts that require specific preparation and safeguards. Dimensional travel, for instance, can expose travelers to entities that feed on consciousness. Without proper training and mental discipline, attempting such magic would be suicide. The same could be said of the dark side, Mace Windu observed. We teach younglings about its dangers precisely because knowledge without wisdom leads to corruption. Then we have common ground, Strange replied. I'll teach what I can, learn what I can, and trust your judgment about what your order is ready to know. Anakin's datapad chirped with an incoming message. He glanced at it, and his expression darkened. There's been another attack. Separatist forces hit a Republic shipyard at Anaxes. Initial reports suggest they used the same shield-disrupting technology Dooku had at Ord Cestus. How extensive is the damage? Obi-Wan asked. Unknown. Communications are sporadic. Anakin stood, his restless energy filling the room. We should deploy immediately. No, Mace Windu said firmly. Your battalion just returned from combat. The 104th is already en route to Anaxes under Master Plo Koon's command. You're needed here, Anakin. The Council has another assignment for you. Anakin's jaw clenched, and Strange recognized the expression, a soldier frustrated by command decisions that kept him from the front lines. It was the look of someone who defined themselves through action. You do not yet touch it, you did. Curious, this is. Troubling, perhaps. But also, illuminating. Always believed we have, that the Force is in all things. Proof of this, you may be. Use it as we do, you cannot. But interact with it? Yes. Possible, this appears to be. Anakin leaned back in his chair, his mechanical hand drumming against the table. The bottom line is he saved hundreds of lives and held off Dooku long enough for us to complete the mission. Everything else is philosophical debate. Philosophy matters when it comes to the Force, Windu countered. The difference between a Jedi and a Sith is often philosophical. How we view power, how we use it, what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve our goals, these questions define us. Then let me be clear about my philosophy, Strange said, his voice calm but firm. I don't worship power. I use it as a tool to protect people who can't protect themselves. In my dimension, I've faced entities that could destroy planets with a thought, and I've negotiated with cosmic forces that view mortality as an amusing curiosity. I don't have the luxury of dogmatic purity about power sources. I use what works, within ethical boundaries I've defined through experience. The room fell silent. Ahsoka watched Strange with open fascination, while Obi-Wan stroked his beard thoughtfully. Mace Windu's expression remained unreadable, but Strange caught a flicker of something in his eyes, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. Your actions saved lives, Obi-Wan said finally. That should be the primary consideration. However, Master Windu raises valid concerns about your methods. Perhaps what we need is better understanding on both sides. You don't understand the Force, and we don't understand your mystic arts. Knowledge shared could benefit everyone. Agreed, Yoda said, his ears twitching. Teach each other, you could. Learn from Strange, we might. Learn from us, he might. Dangerous times these are. And filtered through enough security scanning that no one expects organic infiltration. We'll need to hold our breath for about 2 minutes while the system cycles. 2 minutes underwater in industrial waste. Strange asked. I did say extremely unpleasant, Anakin replied cheerfully. Ahsoka made a face. I hate these kinds of missions. Could be worse, Rex offered. Could be 3 minutes. Despite the grim nature of the mission, Strange found himself almost amused by the gallows humor. These people faced death regularly and dealt with it through jokes and camaraderie. It reminded him of the way surgeons would crack dark humor in operating rooms during impossible cases, a coping mechanism that kept terror at bay. They spent the next 3 hours reviewing contingencies, memorizing facility layouts, and practicing hand signals for silent communication. Strange learned that clone troopers had an entire language of tactical gestures, refined through countless battles into an efficient system that required no verbal communication. Finally, as the Coruscant night deepened outside, Anakin dismissed the team. Get some rest. We leave at 0500. And Strange, he paused, thank you for doing this. I know it's not your fight. Any fight against reckless dimensional experimentation is my fight, Strange replied. Whether it's in my galaxy or yours. As Strange returned to his quarters, exhaustion pulled at him like a physical weight. But sleep was elusive. His mind kept circling back to Obi-Wan's words about adaptation, to the mission tomorrow, to the growing realization that he was becoming entangled in this galaxy's fate far more deeply than he'd intended. He stood at the window, looking out at the endless city lights, and wondered if somewhere in the infinite multiverse, there was a version of him who'd found a simple, straightforward way home. Standard Tuesday, then, Ahsoka said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The meeting concluded with operational details, equipment requisitions, flight plans, backup extraction protocols. Strange absorbed it all with growing unease. This wasn't like his work on Earth, where he could usually operate independently, retreat to the sanctum if things went wrong, or call on allies like Wong for support. Here, he was embedded in a military structure fighting a war he didn't fully understand, in a galaxy whose rules he was still learning. As the others filed out, Obi-Wan lingered behind. "A word, Dr. Strange?" Strange nodded, and they walked together through the temple's corridors. Evening meditation sessions were beginning, and they passed halls where Jedi sat in silent contemplation, their collective presence in the Force creating a peaceful atmosphere that even Strange could perceive. "You're concerned about this mission," Obi-Wan observed. It wasn't a question. "I'm concerned about the implications," Strange replied. "If the Separatists are studying dimensional science based on my arrival, then I'm responsible for whatever they discover. Every catastrophe that results from their research is on my conscience." "The Force brought you here for a reason," Obi-Wan said gently. "We don't always understand the why immediately, but in time, the pattern reveals itself." "I don't believe in destiny," Strange said. "I believe in choices. And right now, I'm choosing to prevent a dimensional catastrophe, regardless of whose war I'm caught in the middle of." They reached the temple's meditation gardens, a rare oasis of natural greenery in Coruscant's urban sprawl. Obi-Wan led Strange to a quiet corner where a small fountain burbled peacefully, its water maintained by ancient technology that had outlasted empires. A version who wasn't about to infiltrate an enemy facility, who wasn't learning to adapt magic to alien power sources, who wasn't making friends with warriors fighting a war that would shape their galaxy's future. But that version of Stephen Strange wouldn't be him. He'd never taken the easy path, never chosen safety over necessity. The Ancient One had seen that quality in him, recognized it as both strength and weakness. Tomorrow, he would descend into an enemy facility in a dimension not his own, using magic that barely functioned, to prevent a catastrophe that existed because he'd been pulled here in the first place. Just another impossible situation requiring an impossible solution. Strange smiled grimly at his reflection in the window. Some things, apparently, transcended dimensional boundaries. The Separatist shuttle was cramped, poorly maintained, and smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and something Strange couldn't identify but suspected was a biological residue he didn't want to contemplate. Anakin piloted with casual confidence, his mechanical hand moving across controls while maintaining a running commentary about the ship's deficiencies. "Stabilizers are shot, hyperdrive sounds like it's held together with prayer and spare parts, and whoever did maintenance last apparently thought optional meant unnecessary," Anakin said, pulling the ship into a steep dive toward Raxus's cloud-covered surface. "Perfect cover for a stealth insertion." "Because nothing says stealth like a ship falling apart mid-flight," Ahsoka observed from the co-pilot's seat, monitoring the sensor displays for Separatist patrols. Strange sat in the cargo hold with Rex and 4 other clone specialists, Tech, a trooper with modified armor covered in extra equipment, Wrecker, who lived up to his name with a massive frame and demolition gear, Crosshair, whose customized rifle spoke to specialized marksmanship, and Echo, whose cybernetic enhancements suggested a complicated history Strange didn't feel qualified to ask about. "Dr. Strange," Tech said, adjusting his helmet's built-in scanner, "I've been reviewing the energy readings from your confrontation with Count Dooku. The dimensional distortion you created registered on Republic sensors from 3 star systems away. Fascinating interaction between mystical energy matrices and local spacetime curvature. You understood what I did?" Strange asked, surprised. "I understood the sensor readings," Tech clarified. "The underlying principles remain beyond current scientific framework. Though I theorize your magic operates on quantum-dimensional frequencies that intersect with but remain distinct from the Force's midichlorian-mediated biological field." Strange blinked. "That's, actually a fairly accurate assessment. You have physicists in this galaxy who study dimensional theory?" "Limited study," Tech replied. "Hyperspace research touches on dimensional physics, but most scientists consider alternate realities theoretical rather than practical. Your arrival has created significant interest in academic circles, though the war limits research opportunities. The shuttle shuddered as it penetrated Raxus's upper atmosphere. Through the viewport, Strange glimpsed a world that seemed caught between industrial development and environmental collapse. Factories belched smoke into toxic skies, cities sprawled without apparent planning, and vast waste disposal sites scarred the landscape like open wounds. The Separatist capital, Ahsoka said quietly. They claim they're building a better future, free from Republic corruption. But all I see is exploitation wearing a different flag. War makes hypocrites of everyone, Strange observed. The question is whether the hypocrisy serves a greater good or just different masters. Anakin guided the shuttle toward an industrial sector on the planet's western continent, following approach vectors Tech had programmed based on stolen Separatist flight patterns. They passed other ships, cargo haulers, patrol craft, civilian transports, without drawing attention. The forged credentials held, and within 30 minutes, they'd landed in a commercial spaceport's overflow section. "We're 2 kilometers from the target facility," Rex reported, checking his tactical display. "Security patrols rotate every 6 hours, next rotation in 45 minutes. We move now, we should reach the entry point during the shift change." They disembarked in pairs, dressed in civilian clothing over their armor and weapons. The clones could pass for human workers at a distance, while Strange's Earth clothing was exotic enough to suggest an Outer Rim trader. Ahsoka had reluctantly covered her distinctive head tails with a hooded cloak. And Anakin walked with a deliberate slouch that transformed his bearing from confident general to tired laborer. The streets of Raxus carried the grimy reality of war's industrial heart. Propaganda posters proclaimed separatist ideals: freedom from Republic tyranny, prosperity through independence, strength through unity. But the people Strange saw looked exhausted, ground down by the same economic pressures and military demands that plagued Republic worlds. Different flags, same suffering. They navigated through factory districts where droid workers moved with mechanical precision, past residential blocks where families tried to maintain normal lives despite constant military presence, and finally into an abandoned industrial zone that the facility's architects had apparently chosen for its isolation. The target building rose from the landscape like a bunker preparing for siege. Reinforced Durasteel walls, minimal windows, automated defense turrets scanning approaches with sensor arrays. The main entrance bristled with security checkpoints and battle droid guards. But around the back, partially hidden by refuse containers and defunct machinery, Strange spotted their entry point. The waste disposal chute was exactly as unpleasant as Anakin had promised. "Remember," Rex said as Tech accessed the chute's control panel, 2 minutes underwater. "Don't panic, don't struggle, just let the current carry you through the filtration system. The exit pool should be breathable atmosphere." "Should be?" Strange asked. 87% probability, Tech replied, which Strange found significantly less reassuring than 100%. Wrecker went first, his bulk disappearing into the dark opening with surprising grace. Then Crosshair, Echo, Tech, and Rex, each vanishing into the chute with professional efficiency. Ahsoka flashed Strange an encouraging smile before following, her presence in the Force dimming as she descended. "Please," Dooku interrupted with dismissive amusement. "Your Republic intelligence network is compromised at multiple levels. I knew you'd be coming the moment the Council approved this mission. I simply needed to determine when." His gaze fixed on Strange. "I needed you to see this. To understand what your arrival has made possible." Strange studied the device with growing horror. "You've built a dimensional gateway. An unstable, unshielded portal into realities you can't possibly comprehend." "On the contrary," Dooku said, gesturing to the calculations surrounding them. "We comprehend perfectly. Your arrival created a dimensional signature we've been studying. This device replicates that signature, allowing us to reach into other realities and extract what we need. Resources. Technology. Knowledge that the Republic doesn't possess." "You're insane," Strange said flatly. "Uncontrolled dimensional portals don't give you access to resources, they give hostile entities access to you. There are things in the dark dimensions that would use this gateway to flood into your galaxy. Things that would make your war look like children playing with toys. Dooku's expression remained calm, but Strange caught a flicker of uncertainty. We have containment protocols. No, you don't, Strange interrupted, walking toward the device despite Rex's hissed warning. I can see the design flaws from here. Your containment fields are based on Force energy signatures, but dimensional entities don't register on the Force. They'd pass through your barriers like they don't exist. And this instability, he gestured to the wavering vortex, suggests you've already attracted attention from something on the other side. As if responding to his words, the vortex pulsed. Something moved within it, eh? Negative, Tech replied, firing at the Devourer despite knowing it was futile. The device has internal power cells. I'd need direct access to the control systems, which are on the opposite side of that thing. The Devourer's assault on Strange's containment intensified. Cracks appeared in the golden barriers, spreading like fractures through glass. Strange poured more energy into the spell, drawing on reserves he didn't have, feeling his body begin to fail under the strain. Through the cracks, he saw more movement in the gateway. The lesser Devourer had been a scout. Something larger was coming through. Everyone fall back. Strange commanded, his voice strained. I'm going to collapse the containment, it's the only way to disrupt the gateway's dimensional anchor. Get clear now. What about you? Ahsoka called out, still engaged with Dooku. I'll manage, Strange lied. Collapsing a containment spell while the entity was still active would release a burst of dimensional energy that might kill him. But it would also create a localized dimensional storm that should destabilize the gateway long enough for it to be destroyed. Rex made the tactical decision instantly. Echo, Wrecker, plant charges on the gateway supports. Crosshair, cover them. Tech, prepare for emergency extraction. Anakin drove Dooku back with a powerful overhead strike, then broke off from the duel. Retreat is necessary, Obi-Wan's voice cut through the chaos. Strange's heart sank as he realized more people had arrived. The Jedi Master stood in the laboratory entrance with Commander Cody and reinforcements, having apparently followed them despite mission protocols. Dr. Strange. Binding it within mystical barriers that recognized its extradimensional nature. The entity shrieked, a sound that existed more in the mind than in physical space, and thrashed against the containment. Anakin. Strange called out, sweat already beading on his forehead from the effort. The gateway, destroy it. Anakin and Ahsoka ignited their lightsabers, moving to flank the dimensional device. But Dooku moved to intercept, his own crimson blade blazing to life. I won't let you destroy months of research, Dooku said, his voice tight with controlled fury. This technology could end the war, could give the Separatists the advantage we need to. To what? Ahsoka snapped, her dual blades crossing Dooku's in a shower of sparks. Feed more of those things. This isn't a weapon, Count. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Anakin pressed the attack from Dooku's opposite side, his aggressive form overwhelming the Count's elegant defenses. She's right, and you know it. You've made a mistake, Dooku. A catastrophic one. Strange barely registered the lightsaber duel. All his concentration focused on containing the Devourer, which had begun adapting to his binding spell. The entity was learning the mystical patterns, finding weak points, exploiting the limited dimensional energy Strange could access in this galaxy. The cloak of levitation detached from Strange's shoulders and flew toward the dimensional gateway, attempting to physically block it. But the vortex simply absorbed the relic, pulling it into its swirling depths. Strange felt the connection sever, not broken, but stretched across dimensional barriers. Tech. Strange shouted. Can you overload the gateway's power supply? Force a shutdown. Containment fields similar to what he'd seen at Kamartaj but dangerously incomplete in their design. And everywhere, data, holographic displays showing calculations that made Strange's blood run cold. The Separatist researchers had made more progress than should have been possible in only a week. Someone with significant understanding of dimensional physics was guiding this project. They found the central laboratory behind reinforced security that tech needed 3 minutes to bypass. 3 minutes where Strange grew increasingly certain they were running out of time. The feeling of wrongness intensified with each passing second, building towards something catastrophic. The blast door finally opened, revealing a massive circular chamber that resembled the dimensional laboratories in Camartage crossed with Republic technological aesthetics. At the center stood a device that made Strange's mystical training rebel. A ring approximately 3 meters in diameter, covered in circuitry and energy projectors, with a swirling vortex of unstable dimensional energy at its core. And standing before it, reviewing data on a holographic display, was Count Dooku. The fallen Jedi turned slowly, showing no surprise at their presence. Anakin Skywalker. Ahsoka Tano. And of course, Dr. Strange. I've been expecting you. Expecting us? Anakin's hand moved to his lightsaber. This was a stealth infiltration. Please, Dooku interrupted with dismissive amusement. Your Republic intelligence network is compromised at multiple levels. I knew you'd be coming the moment the Council approved this mission. I simply needed to determine when. His gaze fixed on Strange. I needed you to see this. To understand what your arrival has made possible. Strange studied the device with growing horror. You've built a dimensional gateway. An unstable blur of exhausted running, narrow escapes from Separatist patrols drawn by the alarms, and Tech's brilliant improvisation that allowed them to steal a far better shuttle than the wreck they'd arrived in. Strange barely registered any of it, his mind cycling through the implications of what had just happened. He'd channeled the Force. Not as a Jedi would, not with the control and finesse that came from a lifetime of training. But he'd accepted its presence, let it support his magic, and together they'd accomplished what neither could have done alone. It changed everything. As the stolen shuttle broke atmosphere and jumped to hyperspace, leaving Raxus and its secrets behind, Strange sat in the cargo hold and stared at his trembling hands. Hands that had once performed surgery with unmatched precision. Hands that had learned to reshape reality through mystical arts. And now, hands that had touched the Force itself. Obi-Wan sat beside him, saying nothing, simply offering presence and understanding. Finally, Strange spoke. I don't belong to your order. I never will. But I think I need to understand this Force properly. Not to become a Jedi, but to survive in this galaxy until I find a way home. Then we'll teach you, Obi-Wan said simply. And perhaps, in teaching you, we'll learn something ourselves. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched into lines of hyperspace travel, carrying them back toward Coruscant and whatever consequences awaited. Strange closed his eyes and, for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, felt something like hope. The mission had been a success. The dimensional gateway was destroyed. And he'd taken the first step toward truly adapting to this strange new reality. Now he just had to survive whatever came next. Presence that felt ancient, hungry, and utterly alien to this galaxy's reality. Strange felt his mystical senses scream warning, the same sensation he'd experienced when first encountering Dormammu. Shut it down, Strange commanded, his hands already moving through defensive patterns. Now, before. The presence surged forward, and reality fractured. What emerged through the gateway defied easy description. It had form but no fixed shape. Geometry that hurt to perceive, colors that existed outside normal spectrum, and a hunger that radiated like cold fire. Strange recognized it immediately from his studies, a lesser devourer, an entity that fed on dimensional energy and used consumed realities as nesting grounds. The laboratory's lights flickered and died. Emergency systems activated, bathing everything in red warning illumination. Alarms screamed throughout the facility, and Strange heard the distinctive sound of blast doors slamming shut as automated security protocols engaged. The Devourer oriented on the nearest energy source, the research equipment, and began feeding. Machines sparked and died, their power drained in seconds. Then it turned its attention to living beings, sensing the bioelectric energy that sustained them. "Open fire!" Rex shouted, and the clone troopers unleashed concentrated blaster volleys. The energy bolts passed through the Devourer like light through fog, having no visible effect. It drifted toward Wrecker, who backed away while firing his rotary cannon. The sustained firepower did nothing to slow its approach. Strange stepped between them, hands weaving a containment spell he'd learned specifically for dimensional predators. Golden mandalas surrounded the Devourer. The vortex collapsed completely, and the Devourer vanished. Silence fell across the laboratory, broken only by the sound of flames from damaged equipment and heavy breathing from the strike team. Strange released the containment spell and immediately collapsed to his knees, exhaustion overwhelming him. The cloak flew to his side, wrapping around him protectively. Dooku stood frozen, his lightsaber still active, staring at the destroyed gateway with an expression Strange couldn't decipher. Horror. Regret. Calculation about what this failure meant for his war effort. "It seems," Dooku said quietly, "I have underestimated the dangers of dimensional experimentation." He looked at Strange with something approaching respect. "You saved us all, Doctor. Even me." "Why?" "Because letting you die would have meant letting everyone in this facility die," Strange replied, his voice hoarse. "And I took an oath once, first, do no harm. Some oaths transcend conflicts." Dooku deactivated his lightsaber. "Then consider this my return gesture." He tapped a command into his wrist device. "I've disabled the facility's security protocols. You have 5 minutes before Separatist reinforcements arrive. I suggest you use them wisely." Before anyone could respond, the Count activated a personal cloaking device and vanished, his presence in the Force fading as he escaped through corridors only he knew. Anakin started to pursue, but Obi-Wan stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Let him go. We've accomplished the mission objective, the gateway is destroyed. Now we extract before we're trapped." The retreat through the facility was The Jedi Temple's meditation chamber designated for Strange training was deliberately sparse, a circular room with a polished stone floor, walls lined with ancient texts in cases that hummed with preservation fields, and windows that caught the perpetual twilight of Coruscant cityscape. Master Yoda occupied a meditation cushion at the chamber's center, his small form radiating a presence that belied his size. Strange had been training with various Jedi Masters for 3 weeks since the Raxus mission. Mace Windu had taught him Force awareness through combat exercises that left him bruised and humbled. Obi-Wan had guided him in meditation techniques that helped him perceive the Force's flow without trying to control it. Ahsoka had shown him how Jedi sense danger before it manifested, a skill Strange's mystical training had approached from entirely different angles. But Yoda's lessons were different. The ancient Jedi Master didn't instruct so much as observe, offering cryptic statements that required Strange to find his own understanding. "Sit," Yoda commanded, gesturing to a cushion across from him. Strange settled into position, his body protesting the cross-legged posture after hours spent reviewing dimensional research data recovered from Raxus. The Separatist scientists had made troubling progress. Their calculations suggested they'd been communicating with something through the dimensional barriers, receiving guidance from an intelligence that understood both this galaxy's physics and multiversal theory. "Troubled, your mind is," Yoda observed, his ears twitching. "About the research, yes. What it implies. Someone is teaching them," Strange said bluntly. The Separatists didn't develop dimensional science independently in 1 week. They had help from something or someone with knowledge that shouldn't exist in this galaxy. "Something, you say. Not someone." Yoda's eyes, ancient and knowing, studied Strange carefully. "A distinction, there is. There are. You infiltrate the structure, shut down the gateway, and we extract you before the Separatists realize what's happened. That's not a plan. Ahsoka's hologram appeared, her expression concerned. That's barely an outline with huge gaps where certain death should be written. It's what we have, Mace Windu said. Doctor Strange, I won't order you into this mission. You're not part of our order, not subject to our command structure. But I will ask, can you do this? Strange looked at the holographic representation of the dimensional anchor, at the energy readings that indicated something far worse than a simple weapon. This wasn't just Separatist technology, this was the result of guidance from entities that wanted access to this galaxy. Entities that would use the war as cover to establish permanent footholds in reality. If he didn't stop this, the dimensional breaches would continue. More gateways would open. Eventually, something would come through that even he couldn't contain. I can do it, Strange said. But I'll need support. Clone troopers who can function without force guidance, technical expertise to identify power systems, and someone who knows Separatist security protocols. Rex and his team, Anakin said immediately. Best soldiers I've ever worked with, and they don't rely on the Force for combat effectiveness. Tech can handle the technical aspects, and they've infiltrated enough Separatist facilities to write the manual. When do we leave? Strange asked. 4 hours, Mace Windu replied. We're assembling the fleet now. The Chancellor himself has authorized maximum resource allocation. This threat has the Senate's full attention. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Strange reviewed schematics of the dimensional anchor structure. Incomplete information cobbled together from long-range scans and intelligence reports. The building was massive. Computing power requirements. A stable gateway of that size would require enormous energy to collapse. I might be able to disrupt it temporarily, but permanent shutdown would need either destroying the structure or cutting its power supply. Then we destroy it, Mace Windu said firmly. We assemble a strike team, infiltrate the structure, and plant sufficient explosives to ensure complete annihilation. Which means getting through the Separatist fleet protecting it, Obi-Wan observed, his hologram appearing beside Anakin's. We're looking at a heavily fortified position defended by at least 30 capital ships and countless fighters. A direct assault would be suicide. Unless, Anakin said with the tone of someone hatching a dangerously brilliant plan, we don't assault directly. Master Windu, how many Jedi can still function near the dimensional anchor? None, Windu replied. The disruption field extends for thousands of kilometers. Any Jedi who enters it loses their force connection within minutes. Several have already been killed because they couldn't sense incoming fire. But Doctor Strange doesn't use the Force, Anakin continued. His magic operates independently. He could function inside the disruption field while every Jedi is compromised. All eyes turned to Strange. He felt the weight of expectation, the desperate hope of an order facing a threat that specifically targeted their greatest strength. Theoretically, yes, Strange admitted. My magic doesn't rely on the Force, so a Force disruption field shouldn't affect my abilities. But I'd still need a way to reach the structure, and I can't exactly fly through space unprotected. We get you there in a stealth ship, Anakin said, his tactical mind clearly racing ahead. Small craft, minimal profile, slips through their defensive perimeter while they're focused on our capital ships. Through logic alone. He extended his awareness outward, not directing it toward specific targets but simply, allowing it to flow. The Force responded differently than it had during the crisis on Raxus. Instead of the desperate necessity that had forced cooperation between his magic and this galaxy's power, Strange felt something gentler. A current that flowed around and through him, carrying information in forms he didn't consciously recognize but somehow understood. He perceived the temple around them, thousands of Jedi, each a point of light in the Force, interconnected through training and purpose. He felt Coruscant's massive population, trillions of beings creating a vast web of connections. And beyond, faintly, he sensed other points of light across the galaxy. Jedi serving as generals, peacekeepers, diplomats. Each one a strand in a tapestry so vast Strange's mind struggled to comprehend its scale. But there were dark spots too. Voids where the Force seemed to withdraw or corrupt. And disturbingly, some of those voids felt similar to the dimensional instabilities he'd been trained to detect. "You see," Yoda said softly, not quite a question. "I see," Strange confirmed, opening his eyes. "There are at least 3 other locations where dimensional barriers have been weakened. One is..." He concentrated, trying to translate Force perception into galactic coordinates. "Somewhere in the outer rim. The others are more diffuse, harder to pinpoint. More facilities," Yoda said grimly. "More experiments with forces they do not understand. Tell the Council of this, you must." Before Strange could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the temple. Not the urgent wail of attack, but the distinctive pattern that indicated incoming priority communication. Yoda's comlink activated immediately. "Master Yoda," Mace Windu's voice emerged, tight with controlled tension. "Passion to act without wisdom, down this path, Anakin walks. Down this path, Count Dooku fell. And down this path, you will fall also, if humility you do not learn." The rebuke stung because it was accurate. Strange recognized the pattern. He'd fallen into it before, during his early training with the Ancient One. So desperate to regain what he'd lost, so determined to prove his worth, that he'd nearly killed himself stealing forbidden texts and attempting magic beyond his capability. "You're right," Strange admitted quietly. "I've been approaching this like a problem to be solved through sufficient effort and intelligence. But the Force isn't a problem. It's..." He struggled for the right words. "Alive," Yoda finished. "In ways we do not fully understand, alive the Force is. Not conscious as we are conscious, but aware. Present. And it brought you here for a reason, I believe. Not by accident, your arrival was. Not by chance, these dimensional threats emerge now. Connected, these events are. See the pattern, can you?" Strange felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been so focused on finding a way home, on dealing with immediate crises, that he hadn't considered the larger pattern. His arrival creating dimensional disturbances. The Separatists immediately beginning research into dimensional physics. Entities from dark dimensions attempting to breach into this galaxy. It did look suspiciously like a sequence rather than coincidence. "You think something orchestrated my arrival here," Strange said. "Something that wanted me in this galaxy at this specific moment." "No, I do not," Yoda replied. "But ignore the possibility, we should not. Meditate on this, you must. Open yourself to what the Force reveals, not what you seek to discover." They sat in silence for long moments, the sounds of the city filtering through the windows like white noise. Strange attempted to quiet his analytical mind, to stop trying to solve the puzzle. "We've received a distress call from Master Plo Koon's fleet at Anaxes. They've engaged a separatist superweapon, something that's disrupting the Force itself. Jedi are losing their connection, unable to sense danger or use their abilities. They're requesting immediate reinforcement." Strange and Yoda exchanged grim looks. A weapon that disrupted the Force would be catastrophic for the Jedi Order. But Strange's mystical senses were screaming a different warning. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a dimensional breach, similar to what they'd encountered on Raxus but larger and more stable. "Master Windu," Strange said, rising to his feet, "I need to be part of that reinforcement. Whatever's at Anaxes, it's related to the dimensional research. I may be the only person who can counter it." A pause, then, "The Council is convening now. Report to the Strategy Center immediately." The Strategy Center was already crowded when Strange arrived with Yoda. Holographic star charts displayed the Anaxes system, showing Republic fleet positions in red and Separatist forces in blue. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, Republic ships drifting without coordination, Jedi generals unable to sense enemy movements, and a massive structure at the system's center that pulsed with energy reading Strange recognized with growing horror. "That's not a superweapon," Strange said, studying the hologram. "That's a dimensional anchor. They've found a way to stabilize a gateway and use it to project an energy field that disrupts force connections." Anakin, present via holographic projection from the negotiator, leaned forward. "Can you shut it down like you did on Raxus?" "Not remotely. I'd need to be physically present, and even then." Strange traced calculations in the air, his mystical training automatically. The stealth ship tumbled, system sparking, and the cloaking device died with a distinctive whine. "Cloaks offline," Hera announced, fighting to stabilize their trajectory. "We're visible to every sensor in the system." "New plan, crash landing through their hangar bay." "That's not a plan," Crosshair said, bracing himself. "That's falling with style." "I'll take what I can get," Hera replied, and aimed the damaged ship directly at the dimensional anchor's hangar entrance. They hit the energy barrier protecting the hangar at speed that should have vaporized them. Instead, the barrier flickered, destabilized by proximity to the dimensional breaches, and they punched through. The ship skidded across the hangar deck, tearing through battle droids and equipment, before slamming into a support pillar hard enough to deploy every emergency system simultaneously. Strange pulled himself from the wreckage, the cloak of levitation cushioning him from the worst impact. Around him, the clone team was already deploying, weapons ready, moving with professional precision despite the crash. Battle droids were converging from multiple directions, their vocabulators announcing targets identified and engagement protocols initiated. Blaster fire filled the hangar, and Strange realized with crystal clarity that the mission had officially moved from stealth infiltration to desperate assault. "Tech!" Strange called out over the weapon's fire. "Where's the main power core?" "Lower levels, Section 7, Tech replied, his rifle dropping droids with precision shots. "But we'll never reach it fighting through these numbers. We need a different approach." Strange looked up at the hangar's ceiling, perceiving the dimensional instabilities that permeated the entire structure. The gateways were directly above them, 3 floors up, pulsing with energies that made his mystical senses scream. Larger than many Republic cruisers, and its interior was a maze of power conduits, defensive systems, and what appeared to be research laboratories. Rex assembled his team with characteristic efficiency: Echo, Tech, Wrecker, Crosshair, and 2 additional specialists, Hunter, whose enhanced senses would help navigate the structure, and Omega, a young clone whose analytical mind rivaled Tech's but who shouldn't be anywhere near a combat zone in Strange's opinion. "She stays on the ship," Rex said firmly when Strange raised the issue. "But we need her for remote technical support. No one better at slicing separatist systems." Strange didn't like it, but he understood the tactical necessity. Child soldiers were an obscenity, but this war had apparently normalized many obscenities. The stealth ship was a marvel of Republic engineering. A craft designed for infiltration missions, equipped with advanced cloaking technology, minimal weapons, and engines optimized for silent running. The pilot was a woman named Hera, a Twi'lek whose reputation for impossible flying preceded her. "Dr. Strange," Hera said as he boarded, "I've heard about what you did on Raxus. You stood between the team and something from another dimension. That takes courage most people don't have." "Courage or stupidity," Strange replied, settling into the co-pilot's seat. "The line blurs during crises." The journey to Anaxes took 8 hours through hyperspace, during which Strange attempted to rest and failed completely. His mind kept cycling through scenarios, calculating probabilities, identifying failure points in their minimal plan. The surgeon in him recognized the feeling. Preoperative anxiety, the knowledge that lives depended on his skill and that mistakes would be measured in bodies. They emerged from hyperspace at the system's edge, and the scope of the battle became immediately apparent. "Entities in the dark dimensions that have existed since before my reality's universe began," Strange explained. They're intelligent, patient, and endlessly hungry for new realities to consume or corrupt. If one of them has found a way to communicate with your galaxy, to whisper guidance to scientists who don't understand what they're dealing with. He trailed off, the implications too dark to fully voice. Then the war, Yoda said quietly, merely a distraction it becomes. While the galaxy tears itself apart, a greater threat waits in shadows no one perceives. Exactly. Strange rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar ache of too little sleep and too much stress. I need to find a way to detect dimensional instabilities across broader ranges. If there are other facilities attempting similar experiments, we need to know before they open gateways that can't be closed. Help with this, you believe the Force can? I know it can, Strange replied. The Force is omnipresent in your galaxy, it touches everything, connects everything. If I could learn to perceive dimensional instabilities through the Force rather than through mystical senses alone, I'd have access to a detection network that spans star systems. Yoda made a thoughtful humming sound. Use the Force as a tool, you would. Not flow with it, but through it reach for what you seek. Is that wrong? Wrong? No. Yoda's expression became difficult to read. Different, yes. Understand, you must, the Force is not power to be taken. A relationship it is. Give and take, flow and stillness, speaking and listening. Use it only as a tool, and empty it becomes. A phone with no one on the other end, Strange considered this carefully. His entire mystical training had been built on the principle that power existed to be shaped by trained will. The Vishanti granted power, but sorcerers directed it. The dark dimensions offered energy, but practitioners controlled how it was used. Even the time stone had been a tool. No, it can, Strange replied. The Force is omnipresent in your galaxy, it touches everything, connects everything. If I could learn to perceive dimensional instabilities through the Force rather than through mystical senses alone, I'd have access to a detection network that spans star systems. Yoda made a thoughtful humming sound. Use the Force as a tool, you would. Not flow with it, but through it reach for what you seek. Is that wrong? Wrong? No. Yoda's expression became difficult to read. Different, yes. Understand, you must, the Force is not power to be taken. A relationship it is. Give and take, flow and stillness, speaking and listening. Use it only as a tool, and empty it becomes. A phone with no one on the other end, Strange considered this carefully. His entire mystical training had been built on the principle that power existed to be shaped by trained will. The Vishanti granted power, but sorcerers directed it. The dark dimensions offered energy, but practitioners controlled how it was used. Even the time stone had been a tool, immensely powerful, but ultimately subject to his command. The Force apparently didn't work that way. You're saying I need to develop an actual relationship with the Force, Strange said slowly. Not just learn to sense it or use it, but communicate with it. Communicate? Yoda's ears drooped slightly. Wrong word, that is. The Force does not speak as you and I speak. But listen, it does. Guide, it does. Those who open themselves to its guidance, wisdom they find. Those who demand it serve their purposes, emptiness they create. That's philosophically elegant, Strange said with a trace of frustration, but I'm trying to prevent dimensional catastrophe. I don't have time for philosophical purity. Yoda's walking stick struck the floor with surprising force. Time, you say? Urgency? These, the dark side feeds upon. Fear of what may come, anger at limitations. Then we don't fight through, Strange said, his hands already moving. We go up. Golden energy erupted from his palms, and the cloak of levitation expanded to impossible size, wrapping around the entire team. Strange pulled them upward, through the ceiling, not breaking through but phasing through dimensional space, a technique that barely functioned here but worked just enough. They emerged in chaos. The gateway chamber was massive, and 3 swirling vortices dominated the space, each one tearing at reality's fabric. Separatist technicians fled screaming as dimensional entities, lesser manifestations of the things Strange had fought before, fed on the equipment and began seeking other energy sources. And through the largest gateway, something vast was beginning to emerge. Strange recognized it from ancient texts in Kamartaj's library. A greater devourer, an entity that had consumed entire dimensions and left nothing but void in its wake. Everyone, Strange said, his voice absolutely calm despite the terror he felt, this situation has just become significantly worse. The greater devourer existed in states that human perception couldn't fully process. Strange's mystical training allowed him to perceive its fundamental nature, a being composed of consumed realities, each victim dimension compressed into its impossible geometry. Where lesser devourers fed on energy, this entity fed on existence itself, unmaking whatever it touched at a level more fundamental than mere destruction. And it was halfway through the gateway. Rex, Strange said, his voice cutting through the chaos, get your team to the power core. You have maybe 3 minutes before that thing fully manifests. When I give the signal, cut all power to this facility. Everything. Understood? What signal? Rex demanded, firing at a technician who'd drawn a weapon. You'll know it when you see it. Strange's hands were already moving through complex patterns, drawing on every scrap of dimensional energy he could reach. Now go. The clone team didn't hesitate. Rex, Tech, Wrecker, Crosshair, Echo, and Hunter moved as one unit, fighting through panicked separatist personnel and automated defenses toward the lower levels. Strange stood alone in the gateway chamber, facing an entity that had ended civilizations, and began the most dangerous spell he'd ever attempted. The Vishanti's Shield, a construct designed to seal dimensional breaches by creating a perfect barrier between realities. Strange had used it once before, during the incident with Dormammu, but that had been in his dimension where he could draw unlimited power from the dark dimension itself through the time loop. Here, his power reserves were limited, his connection to dimensional energy attenuated across unfathomable distances. Would have to be enough. Golden light erupted from Strange's position, expanding outward in geometric patterns that grew more complex with each iteration. The spell structure surrounded the largest gateway, attempting to force the dimensional breach closed while the greater devourer was. That had been projecting the force disruption field collapsed. Strange felt the shift immediately, the force came rushing back into the area like a tidal wave, filling a void that had existed for hours. And with it came something Strange hadn't anticipated. The force recognized the greater devourer as a wound in reality, an absence where life should exist. And the force, in its vast and incomprehensible way, rejected it. What happened next defied Strange's understanding of either mystical or force-based physics. The force didn't attack the devourer, it simply filled the space the entity occupied, existing in the same location simultaneously. 2 fundamental forces of different realities attempting to occupy identical space. The result was catastrophic for the devourer. Its form began breaking apart, unable to maintain coherence while the force rewrote the rules of reality around it. The entity thrashed, pulling backward through the gateway, retreating into its home dimension with a psychic shriek that would probably haunt Strange's dreams for years. The main gateway collapsed. All 3 breaches sealed completely. And the dimensional anchor structure began tearing itself apart as systems overloaded and structural supports failed without power. Strange floated in zero gravity, the cloak supporting him as consciousness slipped away. He'd done it. Paid a terrible price, but done it. The facility was dying, taking its dimensional research with it, and the invasion had been stopped. He just needed to stay conscious long enough for extraction. His body disagreed with that assessment and began shutting down entirely. The next thing Strange perceived was cold, the distinctive chill of Bacta gel surrounding his body. He was suspended in a medical tank, breathing apparatus covering his face, medical sensors attached to every surface. Through the transparent walls, he could see a Republic medical bay. And standing watch were Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Rex. Strange movement must have triggered alerts because all three immediately approached the tank. A medical droid began the emergence protocol, draining the Bacta and removing the breathing apparatus. Strange coughed, his lungs protesting the transition back to normal atmosphere. "Easy," Obi-Wan said, his hand steadying Strange as he climbed from the tank. "You've been unconscious for 36 hours. Your injuries were extensive." "The mission?" Strange croaked, accepting a robe someone handed him. "Complete success," Rex reported with evident satisfaction. "The dimensional anchor was destroyed completely. Separatist forces retreated once their superweapon failed. And we managed to extract the facility's research data before the structure collapsed, techs being thorough, but preliminary analysis suggests we've captured intelligence that will set back their dimensional weapons program by months, maybe years." "And my team?" "Everyone made it out," Rex confirmed. "Hunter pulled you from the gateway chamber after you passed out. Hera somehow got our wrecked ship functional again and extracted us under fire. 0 casualties, unless you count the Separatist technicians who didn't evacuate in time." Strange felt relief flood through him, strong enough to make him sway. Obi-Wan guided him to a medical bed, and Strange sat heavily, his body still recovering from burning his essential pattern. "What you did," Anakin said quietly, his expression difficult to read, "was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed. Probably both. The Jedi Masters who sensed what happened said you were burning your own existence to fuel that spell. They said you should be dead. That by all rights and natural laws, you shouldn't still exist. I've died before," Strange said, attempting levity and failing. "It gets easier with practice. Just like the car accident that destroyed his hands. Just like every time he'd overestimated his capabilities and paid in blood and pain. No. Not like those times. This time, people were depending on him. The clone team below, fighting to complete their mission. The Jedi fleet outside, struggling against an enemy they couldn't properly fight. The entire galaxy, unaware that dimensional entities were attempting invasion. If Strange died here, at least he'd die doing what he'd sworn to do. Protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He pulled deeper, past life force, past the biological energy that sustained his body. He reached for something more fundamental, the pattern that defined Stephen Strange across all realities, the essential self that existed whether he lived or died. The Ancient One had warned him never to touch this, that burning one's essential pattern was how sorcerers erased themselves from existence entirely. Strange touched it anyway. Power flooded through him, vast and terrible and absolutely final. This wasn't energy he could replenish or recover from. This was spending himself, converting his very existence into mystical force. But it was enough. More than enough. The two Vishanti's shield stabilized completely, sealing the smaller gateways with finality that would require months to breach again. And Strange had power remaining to craft a third construct, smaller but precisely targeted. He shaped it into a blade of pure dimensional energy and drove it into the main gateway structure, not trying to close the breach but to destabilize it catastrophically. The gateway shuddered. The Devourer screamed. And reality itself began to tear. "Rex!" Strange shouted, his voice raw. "Now! Cut the power now!" 3 levels below, shaped charges detonated in perfect sequence. The facility's power core exploded, sending a shockwave through every system. Lights died. Gravity failed. And critically, the dimensional anchor. Facilities will open gateways we can't properly seal. Entities will breach into our reality that we don't know how to fight. You're not responsible for saving the galaxy, Stephen. But you're uniquely positioned to help. The choice, as always, is yours. Strange looked at his hands, still trembling slightly from back to recovery, still bearing the scars from the car accident that had destroyed his surgical career. These hands had learned to reshape reality, to defend his dimension from threats beyond imagination. Now they were being asked to defend an entirely different galaxy from similar threats. The logical choice was to decline. To focus on finding a way home, on returning to his own reality where he had responsibilities and obligations. The Sanctum Sanctorum needed its defender. Earth needed its Sorcerer Supreme. But this galaxy needed someone too. Needed someone who understood that dimensional barriers were thin, that entities lurked in the spaces between realities, and that opening gates without proper safeguards was inviting catastrophe. If I do this, Strange said slowly, I do it my way. I don't follow military protocols I consider counterproductive. I don't risk civilian lives for strategic advantage. And I continue searching for a way home. This is temporary assistance, not permanent allegiance. Understood, Obi-Wan replied. The council expected nothing less. Then I accept, Strange said. On one condition, I need access to your best theoretical physicists and force researchers. If I'm going to find these facilities and shut them down permanently, I need to understand how dimensional physics works in your galaxy. The rules are different here than on Earth, and I'm still operating partially blind. We'll arrange it, Anakin promised. In the meantime, you should rest. The medical droids say you need at least another week of recovery before you're fit for active duty. That's not funny, Obi-Wan said firmly. Stephen, what you did, sacrificing yourself to save others, is noble. But there's a difference between sacrifice and suicide. We need you alive, functioning, not burning yourself out in desperate last stands. Strange wanted to argue, to point out that desperate last stands were sometimes the only option. But the concern in both Jedi's expressions stopped him. They weren't judging him, they were worried about him. When had that happened? When had these warriors from an alien galaxy become people whose opinions mattered? I'll try to be more careful, Strange said, knowing it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Though in my defense, fighting dimensional entities rarely allows for careful approaches. The Council wants to debrief you once you're recovered, Obi-Wan said. But there's something else you should know. The Force disruption field affected every Jedi in the system. Hundreds of us simultaneously lost our connection. It was terrifying, Stephen. For most of us, the Force has been a constant presence our entire lives. Having it suddenly severed felt like losing a sense. Like going blind and deaf simultaneously. But when it came back, Anakin continued, his voice holding a note of wonder, it was different. Stronger, maybe. Or more present. Like it had been, compressed. And then expanded to fill the void that weapon created. Several masters are saying they can perceive things now they couldn't before. Connections that were subtle became obvious. Strange processed this information with growing unease. You're saying my actions didn't just stop the invasion, they changed something fundamental about how the Force manifests in that region of space. Possibly, Obi-Wan admitted. We don't fully understand what happened. The interaction between your dimensional magic, the Devourer entity, and the Force when it came rushing back, it created ripples we're still measuring. Still partially manifested. If Strange could sever it, trap part of the entity on each side of reality, it might destabilize enough to retreat. The Devourer noticed him. Its attention was like being observed by a malevolent god. Strange felt his consciousness begin to fragment under that gaze, his sense of self eroding as the entity attempted to unmake him at the conceptual level. His name became uncertain. His memories began dissolving. Stephen Strange, who was that? Had he ever been anyone? The cloak of levitation wrapped around him tighter, its ancient magic providing an anchor point. Right. He was Dr. Stephen Strange, former neurosurgeon, master of the mystic arts, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth. He had died 14 million times and continued fighting. One alien entity, no matter how powerful, would not unmake him. The Vishanti's shield snapped into place, and the gateway began contracting. The Devourer shrieked. A sound that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, that made reality itself vibrate in sympathetic resonance. It pulled backward, trying to retreat through the closing gateway, but Strange held firm. The spell structure tightened like a noose, cutting into the entity's impossible flesh. Then the two smaller gateways pulsed, and Strange realized his mistake. The Separatists hadn't created three separate breaches, they'd created a network. Power from the smaller gateways fed into the larger one, providing additional dimensional energy that the Devourer was now using to fight Strange's containment. He needed to shut down all three simultaneously, which was impossible. Even at full power on Earth, Strange couldn't maintain three separate Vishanti's shields. Here, with diminished capacity, attempting it would kill him. The surgical part of his mind, the aspect that had made him the best neurosurgeon in New York, assessed the situation with clinical detachment. Probability of success, less than 1%. Probability of survival, effectively 0. Recommended course of action, find alternative solution or accept mission failure. Strange had never been good at accepting failure. He released the Vishanti's shield on the main gateway and instead redirected all his power into the two smaller breaches. Golden mandalas snapped into place over both simultaneously, sealing them with force that made blood vessels burst in strange size from the strain. The network broke. Power stopped flowing into the main gateway. The greater Devourer, suddenly cut off from additional dimensional energy, thrashed violently. Its partially manifested form began destabilizing, losing coherence as the gateway could no longer support its full mass. But it was learning, adapting, finding ways to anchor itself in this reality using the facility's own dimensional research equipment as tethers. Strange felt his power guttering like a candle in a hurricane. Maintaining two Vishanti's shields simultaneously was beyond his current capability. He was burning through life force now, converting his own biological energy into mystical power. His hands shook, blood dripping from his nose and ears, vision blurring at the edges. The cloak detached from his shoulders and flew toward the main gateway, wrapping around the Devourer's partially manifested form. The ancient relic couldn't harm the entity, but it could interfere with its attempts to stabilize. Golden fabric wound through impossible geometry, disrupting the anchor points, buying Strange precious seconds. Through the facility's intercoms, Strange heard Rex's voice, power core located. Multiple redundant systems, we need at least 2 minutes to plant charges and ensure complete shutdown. 2 minutes. Strange had maybe 30 seconds of consciousness remaining at this burn rate. His body was shutting down, systems failing under the strain of converting life into magic. He'd pushed too hard, demanded too much, and now he was paying the price. Strange wanted to protest, to insist he could function now, but his body chose that moment to remind him exactly how much damage he'd sustained. Every muscle ached. His hands trembled with more than just nerve damage. And the hollow feeling where he'd burned his essential pattern hadn't fully recovered. A week, Strange agreed reluctantly. But I want those research materials delivered to my quarters immediately. If I'm going to be bedridden, I might as well use the time productively. Rex saluted. I'll inform my team they're now part of this task force. They'll be honored to serve under your command, sir. I'm not, sir, Strange said automatically. I'm just someone trying to prevent dimensional catastrophe. Respectfully, Rex replied with what might have been amusement, that makes you exactly the kind of sir worth following. After they left, Strange lay back on the medical bed and stared at the ceiling. A month ago, he'd been in the Sanctum Sanctorum, dealing with routine mystical threats and studying ancient texts. Now he was in a galaxy far from home, recovering from fighting an entity that consumed realities, having just accepted command of a military task force. The multiverse had a sense of humor, apparently. Through the medical bay window, Strange could see stars, different constellations than Earth's sky, alien patterns that reminded him how far from home he truly was. Somewhere out there, across dimensional barriers he didn't fully understand, his reality continued without him. Wong was probably managing the sanctum, handling threats, wondering where Strange had disappeared to. He would find a way home. Eventually. But first, he had a galaxy to protect from threats it didn't even know existed. The cloak of levitation settled over him like a blanket, its familiar weight comforting. At least some things remained constant across dimensional boundaries. Magic still worked, even if diminished. The principles of protecting others from mystical threats still applied. And apparently, impossible situations still required impossible solutions. Strange closed his eyes and let exhaustion claim him. Tomorrow he would begin planning. He would study this galaxy's dimensional physics, build a team capable of hunting threats across star systems, and figure out how to detect facilities before they opened gateways that couldn't be closed. Tomorrow he would be Dr. Stephen Strange, dimensional threat specialist and reluctant military consultant. Tonight, he was just a man who'd pushed too far and survived by the narrowest margin. A man who'd learned that some battles transcended dimensions, that protecting others was a calling that knew no boundaries, and that home was wherever you chose to make your stand. The cloak tightened around him gently, and Strange felt himself smile. Even in a galaxy far, far away, some companions remained faithful. He would find his way home. But until then, he had work to do. The sleep that finally claimed him was deep and dreamless, the kind of rest that came only after surviving the impossible and accepting the responsibility that survival demanded. Outside, the stars wheeled in their alien patterns, and the Force flowed through all things, carrying whispers of battles yet to come and a sorcerer's choice to stand against the darkness wherever it appeared. The galaxy would remember the name Stephen Strange. And the entities that lurked in dimensional shadows would learn to fear it. 6 months had transformed Strange from an outsider caught in someone else's war into something he'd never expected to become, a bridge between two fundamentally different approaches to reality. The task force he'd built operated from a modified Republic frigate called the Aegis, crewed by specialists who'd learned to trust his seemingly impossible assessments of dimensional threats. Rex commanded the military component with the same disciplined efficiency he'd shown since their first mission together. Tech had become Strange's primary collaborator, translating mystical observations into quantifiable data the Republic could understand. And gradually, other specialists had joined. A Jedi consular named Jocasta Nu who studied ancient force phenomena, a Kaminoan physicist named Nala Se whose work in genetic manipulation had given her unique insights into biological responses to dimensional energy, and surprisingly, Ahsoka Tano, who'd requested transfer from Anakin's command to learn how dimensional threats intersected with the Force. Master Strange, Ahsoka said, entering the Aegis's meditation chamber where Strange had been studying the latest intelligence reports. She'd taken to calling him Master, despite his repeated protests that he wasn't a Jedi. We've detected another dimensional instability, this one in the Alderaan sector. Energy signature matches the Raxus facility's pre-activation phase. Strange pulled up the holographic data, his mystical senses immediately recognizing the pattern. How long until the gateway becomes stable enough for entities to breach through? Tech estimates 72 hours, maybe less. Ahsoka's expression was grim. She'd learned enough about dimensional threats over the past months to understand what unstable gateways meant. The facility is on Delia, a Republic-aligned world with significant civilian population. We can't just destroy it from orbit. No, we'll need surgical infiltration again. Strange stood, the cloak of technology. Earth's dimensional threats could spread to this galaxy. And caught between them would be two civilizations completely unprepared for interdimensional contact. We need to seal the dimensional scar, Strange said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Permanently. It's the only way to prevent the gateway from stabilizing. But that's your only way home, Obi-Wan's hologram materialized beside Anakin's. Apparently the Jedi Council was monitoring as well. If you seal the scar connecting your reality to ours, you'll be trapped here permanently. No way to return to your Earth, your responsibilities, your life. I know, Strange said simply. But I can't let them use my home as a staging ground for invasion. Earth has enough problems without being connected to a galaxy at war. And this galaxy has enough threats without accessing Earth's dimensional dangers. Yoda's hologram appeared, the ancient master's expression sorrowful but understanding. A terrible choice, this is. But yours to make, it remains. Trap yourself here to save both realities, you would. Strange thought about the Sanctum Sanctorum, about Wong managing threats without him, about Earth continuing while he was stranded in an alien galaxy. He thought about the life he'd had, brilliant surgeon, then master of the mystic arts, defender of his reality against cosmic threats. And he thought about what the Ancient One had taught him. The purpose of a sorcerer wasn't to preserve their own existence but to protect others from forces they couldn't comprehend. She'd sacrificed herself to save Strange and countless others. Now he was being asked to make a similar choice. Not death, but exile. Permanent separation from his home reality. But if it prevented interdimensional catastrophe, if it saved both Earth and this galaxy from invasion. Levitation settling around his shoulders with familiar weight. His recovery from the Anax's mission had taken longer than anticipated, burning his essential pattern had consequences he was still discovering. But he'd adapted, learned to draw more efficiently from the Force to supplement his diminished dimensional connection. Not as a Jedi would, but as a sorcerer adapting to available energy sources. The approach Obi-Wan had suggested months ago, adaptation over raw power, had become Strange's operational philosophy. He'd stopped trying to force his Earth-based magic to work unchanged and instead began developing hybrid techniques that combined mystical principles with Force manipulation. The results were unorthodox, occasionally unstable, but undeniably effective. Gather the team, Strange said. Standard loadout, dimensional scanners, suppression charges, and enough firepower to handle whatever's guarding the facility. And Ahsoka, make sure you bring those new force-dampening grenades Tech developed. If the Separatists have stationed Sith apprentices at these facilities, we'll need every advantage. Over the past months, they'd shut down 7-dimensional research facilities across Separatist and Republic space alike. The enemy wasn't just the Separatists. Strange had discovered facilities on Republic worlds where ambitious scientists had attempted their own dimensional experiments, usually with catastrophic results. The task force operated with authorization from both the Jedi Council and the Senate to investigate and neutralize dimensional threats regardless of political boundaries. It had made him enemies on both sides of the war. The mission to Delia proceeded with the practiced efficiency of a team that had executed similar operations repeatedly. They infiltrated the facility, neutralized security, and Strange sealed the dimensional breach before anything significant could manifest. But as they extracted research data, Strange found something that made